Animals usually give warnings before they attack. The problem is, some people think the warning is part of the experience. Hi, it's Austin, and in today's episode, I'm diving into when people provoke animals and get eaten alive. From a tourist who ignored direct warnings and walked toward a pride of lions for a selfie to a wealthy tiger owner who entered an enclosure drunk, tried to hand-feed a fully grown predator, and met the worst fate possible. It was February 22nd, 2014, and the forests of a tiger reserve in Madhya Pradesh were entering the hot, dry period that preceded the monsoon. The deciduous woodland had begun shedding its canopy, opening sightlines through the forest and concentrating wildlife around remaining water sources. This was peak safari season, when thinning vegetation made tiger sightings more frequent and tourist vehicles packed the reserve's dusty track network from dawn until the gates closed at sunset. Gaspar Verbeke was a 34-year-old architectural photographer from Ghent, Belgium, whose professional work had earned him a respected portfolio. Over the previous 2 years, he had developed a growing interest in wildlife photography, booking trips to reserves in East Africa and Southeast Asia. He had never photographed a Bengal tiger in the wild. India's Central Highlands offered the highest density of wild tigers on Earth, and Verbeke had planned this trip for over a year. The reserve operated under strict regulations administered by the Regional Wildlife Authority. All visitors entered by authorized vehicle with a registered guide and driver. Exiting the vehicle for any reason was strictly prohibited, a rule enforced by heavy fines, arrest, and permanent banning from all Indian national parks. Every visitor received this instruction in writing and verbally before entering. Verbeke's vehicle was operated by Bhimrao Khandwe, a 47-year-old driver who had worked the reserve's safari circuit for over 20 years. A registered naturalist guide accompanied the vehicle. At approximately 8:15 a.m., their jeep was among the first to locate a tigress resting in tall grass, roughly 60 yards from the track. The guide noted the location and warned the group that this particular female had been seen with cubs in the area, making her especially defensive. Verbeke fired off frames with his telephoto lens, but the distance and the intervening grass left him dissatisfied. According to the guide's statement to reserve investigators, Verbeke had repeatedly asked whether the vehicle could move closer. The guide explained that the current distance was appropriate. Verbeke's frustration was visible. What happened next, according to statements from the guide, Khandwe, and passengers in a trailing vehicle, unfolded in seconds. During a moment of confusion as multiple vehicles repositioned along the track, Verbeke swung his legs over the far side and dropped to the ground. The guide lunged across the seat to grab him, catching his shirt briefly before Verbeke pulled free. Both the guide and Khandwe shouted. Verbeke had already moved several paces from the vehicle toward the tree line, camera raised, apparently attempting to circle to a clearer angle on the tigress. Bengal tigers are the largest cats in the Indian subcontinent, with adult females weighing between 220 and 350 pounds and measuring up to 8 feet in length. Despite their size, tigers are capable of explosive acceleration, reaching speeds of 30 to 35 miles per hour over short distances. Their primary killing method involves a powerful ambush charge followed by a bite to the neck or throat, where canine teeth up to 3 inches long crush the windpipe or sever major blood vessels, causing rapid incapacitation. Tigresses with cubs are among the most dangerous animals in any forest. The maternal defensive instinct overrides normal avoidance behavior, and a tigress will charge any perceived threat within range of her young, often without warning. The tigress appeared to react almost immediately to his movement on the ground. He had covered barely 10 yards when she charged. Khandwe threw the jeep into reverse, attempting to move closer to the scene, but the tigress closed the distance before the vehicle could reach him. Passengers in the trailing vehicle described the charge as extremely fast, a low movement through the grass. Verbeke apparently turned at the sound but had no time to react. The tigress struck him from the side, driving him to the ground. Her jaws closed around his neck and throat almost instantly. Khandwe edged the jeep forward while sounding the horn, engine roaring. Under the sustained noise and proximity of the vehicle, the tigress appeared to reposition, briefly loosening her grip before disengaging entirely and retreating into the tall grass toward where her cubs were believed to be concealed. Khandwe and the guide reached Verbeke within moments. He had sustained severe trauma to the neck consistent with a tiger bite and was critically injured, likely losing consciousness within moments. Verbeke was rushed toward the reserve's exit gate but showed no signs of life during transport. He was pronounced dead at the district hospital. The reserve temporarily suspended safari operations in the zone. The reserve authority launched a formal investigation, confirming that Verbeke had exited the vehicle against used explicit instructions, entering the defensive perimeter of a tigress with cubs. The tigress was not harmed or relocated, as the attack was classified as a natural defensive response. It was November 11, 2014. The dry season in northern Botswana had drawn the seasonal floodplains down to cracked margins, and the night air across the delta carried the deep silence that settles over the African bush when no wind moves through the scrub. Temperatures dropped sharply after dark, and the camp sat beside dried floodplain channels that, in wet years, carried water through the area, but in the dry months served as natural movement corridors for every large animal in the region. The camp had no perimeter fencing. This was by design. I find that detail unsettling every time I return to it, not because it was wrong, but because it was honest. The camp existed inside the bush, not beside it. Rachel Kim was a 29-year-old travel blogger based in the United States whose platform focused on immersive wildlife and adventure travel experiences. She had built a following through a combination of high-quality field photography and detailed written accounts of remote destinations, and she approached each assignment with the dual perspective of participant and content producer. Her traveling companion, Sophie Lang, 31, worked as a professional photographer and had accompanied her on multiple previous international assignments. The camp manager, Kabalo Moeti, 37, had operated the property for several years and held a detailed working knowledge of the local wildlife patterns, particularly the seasonal movement of large predators and scavengers through the camp area during dry months when food sources became concentrated. During the evening meal, Kim retained a portion of grilled meat, wrapping it and keeping it inside her tent after returning for the night. The camp's standing instructions to all guests, issued at check-in and repeated before each evening, were explicit. No food items of any kind were to be carried into sleeping tents, and nothing edible was to be removed from the communal dining area and taken outside after dark. The reason for this instruction was well established by the camp's operational history. Spotted hyenas in the surrounding area had developed a persistent association between the camp and food odors across multiple dry seasons, and their nightly movement through the tent line was a routine occurrence that staff managed through strict odor control. The instruction was not precautionary, it was operational. There is a difference, and camps like this one know it. Unfenced camps operating inside active wildlife areas function on a system of behavioral controls that substitutes for the physical barrier a fence would provide. Every protocol exists as a component of that system, and the system holds only when every component holds simultaneously. Camps that operate this way typically run without incident across multiple seasons, which can produce a gradual normalization of the rules among guests who have followed them before without consequence. The rules feel precautionary after enough uneventful nights. They are not precautionary. They are the reason the nights were uneventful. At approximately 2 a.m., sounds outside the tent registered as movement nearby. Kim exited the tent, carrying the wrapped meat, with the intention of depositing it near the communal area. Multiple hyenas were already moving through the space between the tents. The animals had been drawn by the concentrated food scent before she had opened the tent door. Spotted hyenas are among the most ecologically successful large carnivores in sub-Saharan Africa, a classification that surprises many visitors who assume they operate primarily as scavengers. Adult hyenas weigh between 90 and 190 pounds and possess the strongest bite force relative to body size of any African carnivore, sufficient to crush large bone entirely. Their intelligence, social coordination, and adaptability make them highly effective at exploiting human environments, and animals that become food-conditioned around camps develop a persistence and directional boldness that escalates significantly when direct food access appears possible. In camp settings, hyena incidents rarely begin as predatory attacks. They begin as opportunistic food-seeking behavior and can escalate sharply when a human drops below upright height, the silhouette these animals are instinctively cautious of, or when food contacts the ground near a position where multiple animals are already competing for access. One animal approached from the front as Kim retreated toward the lit pathway between structures. A second had circled to a position behind her. When she slipped on loose sand near a drainage edge, the wrapped meat fell from her hands to the ground directly beside her. The sudden drop in her body position, combined with the immediate presence of food at ground level, produced a rapid escalation in the surrounding animals' behavior, triggering competing scavenging responses among the group. That sequence, the slip, the drop, the height change, happened in under 2 seconds. The animals were already there, the variables just aligned. Camp staff responded with vehicle floodlights, sustained engine noise, and coordinated shouting from multiple positions, dispersing the animals before physical contact occurred. Kim sustained minor injuries consistent with the fall itself. The camp conducted a full review of its food storage enforcement and guest briefing procedures in the days following the incident. It was September 12, 2018, in a quiet concrete enclosure on the outskirts of a provincial facility, where stagnant water sat dark and still beneath heat-stained walls. The surface barely moved, disturbed only by faint ripples, while rusted railings and damp edges suggested long-term neglect and minimal maintenance. Jerome Castile had spent over 30 years working Mississippi River levees, known as a reliable heavy equipment operator. In 2012, he obtained a rare permit to keep rook, a Nile crocodile, raising and maintaining it alone in a custom enclosure behind his home. Private ownership of this species in Louisiana required strict state permitting and containment standards, which he had met at the time. After being diagnosed with kidney disease in 2018, his strength declined. Realizing he could no longer safely handle the animal, he arranged for Rook's transfer to a wildlife sanctuary and personally assisted with the move, explaining its feeding routine and behavior. The sanctuary covered 12 acres of converted rice fields with connected enclosures and narrow service corridors. Nile crocodiles are among the largest living reptiles, capable of exceeding 16 feet and delivering extremely high bite force. At 11 feet and roughly 800 pounds, had spent years associating human presence at the enclosure's edge with feeding. That conditioning, known in captive management, can increase the likelihood of approach behavior when a person stands at the perimeter. Jerome returned in September for a final visit. That afternoon, Rook had already been fed but remained active, staying near the surface along the enclosure edge. Post-feeding activity is not unusual, especially in warm conditions when metabolism remains elevated. With limited staff on site, Jerome was allowed into a service corridor separated from the water by a 4-foot concrete barrier. That barrier height is below the recommended safety standard for large crocodilians, which typically require higher walls or secondary containment. He brought raw chicken and a long-handled grabber tool, intending to present food from a distance as he had done before. Rook's position indicated elevated risk. The animal held a low-profile posture just beneath the surface, with only the eyes and nostrils visible, oriented directly toward the source of movement. Jerome extended the grabber tool over the barrier, holding the meat a few feet above the waterline. To stabilize himself, he leaned forward, shifting his center of gravity beyond the barrier. This reduced his ability to step back quickly if the animal surged. The attack followed immediately. Rook propelled upward from the water using a rapid tail-driven thrust, covering several feet in a fraction of a second. His jaws opened and closed around Jerome's upper torso. The initial contact point appears consistent with the shoulder and upper chest region, areas within reach given the height and angle over the barrier. The force of the bite displaced Jerome's balance. His footing failed, and both went over the barrier into the enclosure, entering the water almost simultaneously. Once submerged, Rook maintained his hold. Crocodilian teeth are conical and designed to grip rather than slice, preventing easy withdrawal once engaged. Jerome attempted to surface, but the animal's body mass and positioning kept him pinned. The water depth allowed Rook to initiate a rotational maneuver. The crocodile began a death roll, rotating its body along its longitudinal axis. This behavior is used to destabilize prey and apply torque, increasing tissue damage and disorientation, rather than immediately dismembering large prey. Each rotation pulled Jerome through the water, preventing coordinated movement. The sustained bite pressure and rotation resulted in severe trauma, including rib fractures and compromised lung function. Water inhalation likely began during this phase as the airway was intermittently submerged. Within moments, Jerome's movement slowed as breathing became restricted under trauma and submersion. Staff approached but held at the perimeter, following protocol that prohibits entry during an active crocodile attack. Emergency services were called immediately. Responders arrived around 2:47 p.m., delayed by the rural access. By then, the struggle had ended, and Rook remained at the far side of the enclosure. Recovery required tranquilizing the animal and lowering the water level, continuing into the evening. The coroner confirmed severe upper torso trauma, deep bite wounds, multiple rib fractures, and a punctured lung. Drowning was listed as the primary cause of death. The incident prompted a review of enclosure design, supervision, and access procedures. Rook was relocated to a higher security facility, and the sanctuary temporarily closed for safety upgrades. The morning of September 27th, 2015 was everything the Red Sea is known for in the final weeks of summer. The water was warm and extraordinarily clear, visibility stretching 30 meters in every direction. The reef below lit up in the way that makes people understand why they traveled thousands of miles to be here. The surface was flat, the winds light, and the conditions were, by every visible measure, perfect. Ahmed Nasser had described mornings exactly like this one to tourists for 11 years. Ahmed was 36, a Red Sea tour guide based out of Hurghada, who had led more snorkeling trips than he could count across a career that had started when he was barely out of school. He knew the water the way people know their own neighborhoods, the currents, the reef formations, the way the light changed through the afternoon. the spots that were reliable and the spots that required more care. He was calm and competent in the water, the kind of guide that tourists trusted immediately because he carried himself like someone who had never been surprised by anything the ocean had done. That familiarity was, in the end, the thing that killed him. He had chosen an offshore site that day specifically because it was less crowded, a quieter alternative to the main tourist reefs further out, with better visibility and more interesting marine life. It was a site he had used before without incident. What he didn't know was that a fishing vessel had discarded fish waste in the area earlier that morning. The scent trail was already in the water by the time Ahmed's group arrived. The ocean, from the surface, looked exactly as it always did. His group entered the water in good spirits, a mix of experienced snorkelers and beginners, the kind of group Ahmed had managed dozens of times. He positioned himself at the edge of the group as he always did, watching the perimeter, keeping count. For the first few minutes, the dive was everything he had promised. Clear water, healthy reef, the kind of underwater visibility that makes people understand why people become obsessed with the ocean. Then the fish disappeared. It happened quietly. The reef fish that had been moving through the coral simply weren't there anymore. The water grew still in a way that had a different quality than ordinary stillness. Ahmed noticed it. He had seen something like this before. But 11 years of leading tours without a serious incident had built a layer of professional confidence that sat between his instincts and his decisions. And in that moment, the confidence won. He began moving the group toward the boat, calmly, without alarming anyone, the way a good guide does. He did not call them out urgently. He did not treat it as an emergency. The oceanic white-tip appeared shortly after, a single shark, moving with the slow, deliberate confidence that characterizes the species in open water. It began circling at a moderate distance. Ahmed watched it and kept the group moving. He had seen sharks on tours before. Then one of the swimmers panicked. Everything changed at once. The splashing, the sudden erratic movement at the surface, the noise. It hit the water like a signal. The shark's behavior shifted immediately, its wide circles collapsing inward. Ahmed moved toward the panicking swimmer without hesitation, placing himself between the group and the shark, doing exactly what a responsible guide would do. In doing so, he became the most active, most visible figure in the water. What followed was not a sequence that anyone on the boat could describe with clarity afterward. It happened too fast and with too much chaos for that. The shark came in hard, a sudden strike, contact, and then the water around Ahmed erupted into confusion. Snorkelers were screaming, scrambling for the ladder, the crew pulling people aboard with both hands. Someone threw a line, someone else was in the way. The shark was still in the water, still moving, and the group between Ahmed and the boat made retrieval nearly impossible to coordinate. Ahmed sustained fatal injuries before the chaos on the surface could be resolved enough to reach him. By the time the last snorkeler was aboard and the crew could focus entirely on Ahmed, it was too late. He was pulled from the water, but he was already gone. Egyptian maritime authorities opened a formal investigation within 24 hours. The site was closed to tourist operations for 6 weeks and reopened with new protocols, mandatory pre-dive water checks, stricter group positioning guidelines, and emergency signaling requirements for all guides. The morning of October 2nd, 2017 had come in cold and overcast over the rural property outside Glacier, the sky sitting low and flat the way it does in northwestern Montana when the season is turning and the mountains have already made up their mind about it. The grass in the yard was still wet from overnight rain, the tree line pressed close on 3 sides of the property, the forest beginning no more than 40 yards from the back of the house. It was the kind of place where wildlife was not a surprise. It was simply part of the landscape, and the Whitaker family had learned to read it the way you learn to read anything you live alongside long enough. Dana Whitaker was 39, a veterinary technician who had lived on the property with her husband and 2 children for 6 years. The area sat at the edge of established grizzly range. Wildlife officials had documented increased grizzly movement through the region that year, animals pushing further into lower elevations as the season shifted and food sources changed. Black bears were common on the property. A grizzly was a different matter, and Dana knew it. She kept the trash secured. She knew what to do if something large came out of the forest. She was not naive about where she lived. She was experienced in the specific, practical way that people who live adjacent to wilderness tend to be, which is to say, she understood the risks well enough to manage them, right up until the moment the risk she was managing turned out to be something else entirely. The morning had been ordinary. Her husband was inside with the kids. Dana had been moving between the house and the outbuilding, doing the kind of routine weekend work that fills up a Saturday morning on a rural property. The dog had been calm all morning. Then, sometime around 9, it wasn't. The barking started, at the edge of the yard. Not the ordinary kind, but the sustained, low, aggressive kind that means the dog has found something and has decided it is a threat. Dana and her husband both moved to the window. Near the tree line, roughly 40 yards out, a large grizzly stood facing the yard, watching the dog strain against its lead. What neither of them could see from the window was the brush directly behind the bear. 2 cubs were positioned in the undergrowth, close to the tree line, partially hidden. The mother had placed herself between the yard and her cubs. That was the geometry of the situation. Nobody inside the house knew it yet. The dog broke free. Grizzly bears are not predatory toward humans by default, but a female with cubs operates under a completely different set of rules. The maternal defensive response is not a warning. It is not a bluff. It is an immediate, committed charge toward anything perceived as a threat to her offspring. Adult females typically weigh between 250 and 450 pounds and can cover ground at up to 35 miles per hour. The distance between a grizzly at full speed and a person 40 yards away collapses in under 4 seconds. Dana went out after the dog immediately, moving fast across the wet grass, calling it back, closing the distance between herself and the bear. From inside the house, her husband and children watched through the window. The dog ran directly toward the cubs. The moment Dana crossed into the space between the dog and the cubs, shouting, moving quickly, closing distance from the opposite direction, the situation reclassified itself completely. She was not approaching a bear near a tree line. She was approaching a mother bear that had just watched a dog run toward her cubs. And now, a shouting human was closing in from the other side. The grizzly moved. There was no prolonged warning display. A brief surge forward, weight shifting, and then the charge fully committed. She crossed the 40 yards in seconds, low and fast across the wet grass, and hit Dana with the full force of her body weight. The impact drove Dana off her feet and into the ground, hard enough to be visible from the house window. The bear followed her down, one forepaw pinning her to the wet grass, and delivered a single bite to the upper back and shoulder. The deep, crushing bite that grizzlies use in defensive attacks, designed to neutralize a threat as quickly as possible. Dana tried to curl inward to protect her neck and abdomen the way every piece of bear safety literature instructs. The bear struck again at the back of her head. Her husband had reached the door by then. He shouted from the porch. The bear looked up, assessed him across the yard, and then turned and moved back toward the tree line, her cubs falling in behind her. Dana Whitaker did not get up. Emergency responders arrived within 20 minutes. Dana Whitaker was pronounced dead at the scene. Wildlife officials confirmed the bear's behavior was consistent with maternal defensive aggression and noted that grizzly activity in the area had been elevated in the weeks prior, with several reports of animals moving through lower elevations than usual for that time of year. The cubs, invisible from the house, had been the critical factor, the variable that turned a manageable situation into a fatal one before anyone inside had any way of knowing it existed. Dana's husband did not leave the property. That was the part that surprised people who knew him. He stayed in the house, kept the kids in the same school, kept the same routines, and told a neighbor months later that leaving felt like abandoning the last place she had been. The dog recovered from its injuries over several weeks. It never went near the tree line again. September 12, 2015 brought clear skies and moderate temperatures to the private concession bordering Kruger National Park in South Africa. The dry season had left the landscape golden and dusty, with visibility extending for miles across the savanna. The air carried the faint scent of dry grass and red earth, broken occasionally by the distant barking of baboons somewhere deeper in the bush. Richard Caldwell, a 61-year-old oil investor from Texas, had built his fortune through strategic investments in petroleum extraction operations across the southern United States. His wealth had afforded him a lifestyle most could only dream of, including regular expeditions to Africa where he paid premium prices for exclusive hunting experiences. This particular trip marked his 7th visit to southern Africa. Caldwell had arrived at the private reserve 3 days earlier, accompanied by 2 experienced professional guides who specialized in dangerous game tracking. The group had been pursuing a wounded buffalo through dense vegetation, following a blood trail that stretched for nearly 2 miles through tall grass and acacia thickets. As the afternoon sun began its descent, the tracking party noticed vultures circling overhead. Caldwell immediately assumed the buffalo had finally succumbed to its injuries and collapsed somewhere ahead. Despite the guide's urging caution, he insisted on investigating on foot, eager to claim his trophy before scavengers could damage it. The group moved through the tall grass toward the vultures. The guides maintained their rifles at the ready, scanning the surroundings carefully as they pushed through the final stretch of vegetation, and discovered something entirely different from what they had expected. A freshly killed impala lay in a small clearing, its body still warm and bleeding. Surrounding the carcass, partially concealed in the brush, was a pride of African lions that had been feeding quietly when the human intrusion interrupted their meal. The metallic scent of fresh blood hung in the still air, and low warning growls could already be heard from the shadows between the bushes. Before the guides could physically pull Caldwell backward, a lioness defending the kill site launched herself forward from less than 15 meters away. The female lion, weighing roughly 300 pounds, covered the distance in seconds. Her protective instincts had been triggered by the sudden appearance of threats near her food source. African lions are apex predators capable of taking down prey many times their own size. Their jaws can exert tremendous crushing pressure capable of piercing thick hide and bone, and their retractable claws can grow up to 1.5 inches in length. When defending a fresh kill, they become particularly aggressive, viewing any approaching animal as competition for their hard-won meal. A lion at a kill is operating on pure instinct. There is no hesitation, no warning, and no negotiation. The lioness struck Caldwell with devastating force, her front paws connecting with his chest and shoulders, sending him crashing backward into the dirt. The impact was enormous, a dull, heavy thud that echoed across the clearing. Before the guides could react, the predator's jaws clamped down across Caldwell's shoulder and neck. One guide fired a shot into the dirt beside the lioness, but she had already established her grip. The second guide attempted to use his rifle to drive the animal away, but the speed and ferocity of the attack made intervention nearly impossible without risking hitting Caldwell himself. The lioness shook Caldwell violently, her powerful neck muscles whipping his body from side to side. The guides fired additional shots near the lion to startle it without causing a fatal wound. The combination of gunfire and shouting finally caused the lioness to release her grip and retreat toward the rest of the pride. Caldwell lay motionless on the ground, his body bearing massive trauma. The guides immediately radioed for emergency medical evacuation while attempting to stabilize him. A helicopter arrived within 40 minutes, but Caldwell had already lost consciousness from blood loss and shock. Medical personnel worked frantically during the flight, but the injuries were too severe. Caldwell was pronounced dead before reaching the nearest medical facility. The post-incident investigation revealed that the group had violated several safety protocols by approaching an unknown situation without proper reconnaissance and by allowing a client to lead rather than experienced trackers. It was July 23, 2016, and the dry season had noticeably pulled Lake Victoria's shoreline back along Uganda's southeastern coast, exposing wide bands of mudflat. The receding shallows had concentrated crocodile activity along deeper channels and shoreline drop-offs, placing predators in the same waters where local fishing crews worked every day. Okello Wasaja, a 34-year-old commercial fisherman from a small landing site along the lake's northern shore, had spent the better part of 2 decades working these waters. Wasaja was a familiar presence at the landing site, known among other crews for his willingness to work stretches of shoreline that more cautious fishermen avoided during the dry months. He operated a weathered wooden boat with his longtime fishing partner, Kayondo Bizimungu, 40, a quiet, experienced net handler who had fished the same stretch since adolescence. The two men launched most mornings before sunrise, setting gill nets along the shallows where tilapia congregated during the dry months. The pair had launched before dawn that morning, motoring their boat to a familiar stretch of shoreline roughly 2 miles from the landing site. The sky was clear and the water flat, conditions that made the shallows appear deceptively calm. The area was known among local fishermen for reliable catches during the dry season, but also for an increase in crocodile sightings as water levels dropped. Villagers along this section of shore had reported at least 3 livestock taken from the water's edge in recent weeks, including a full-grown goat dragged from a drinking point in broad daylight. Despite the reports, fishing continued. The catches during low water were too valuable for most crews to abandon, and the economic pressure on families who depended on the lake left little room for caution. Wasaja and Bizimungu set their nets in the shallows and returned to deeper water to wait. When they motored back to check the nets later that morning, Wasaja stepped over the side of the boat into waist-deep water to begin hauling the nets by hand, a standard practice along the lake. Bizimungu remained in the boat, managing the lines. Wasaja had his phone sealed inside a small waterproof pouch clipped to the front of his shirt, a habit he had maintained for years to protect the device from spray. Bizimungu later told investigators that Wasaja had been recording a short video of the morning's catch moments before stepping into the water to haul the nets, and had not stopped the recording before entering. Nile crocodiles are among the largest and most dangerous reptilian predators on Earth, with exceptionally large males males capable of exceeding 16 feet in length and weighing over 1,600 pounds. They possess one of the most powerful bite forces of any living animal, generating pressures exceeding 3,700 pounds per square inch, enough to crush bone and sever limbs. Their attack strategy relies on concealment and explosive ambush, launching from beneath murky water with enough force to drag large mammals off riverbanks. Once the initial bite secures the victim, the crocodile initiates a death roll, a violent spinning maneuver designed to disorient prey before dragging it beneath the surface to drown. In the shallow, sediment-heavy waters of Lake Victoria during the dry season, a crocodile can rest motionless within feet of a wading human without being detected. According to testimony gathered by regional wildlife officers and local marine police, the crocodile struck while Wasaja was standing in approximately 3 feet of water, his hands occupied with the tangled gill net. Bizimungu reported that the water erupted without warning directly in front of his partner. The crocodile's jaws clamped around Wasaja's midsection, the force of the strike pulling him off his feet and beneath the surface almost instantly. Bizimungu described churning water, a spray of mud, and then a sudden drag toward deeper water as the crocodile initiated the death roll. The violent turbulence moved outward from the boat, the disturbance shifting direction as the animal pulled its grip beneath the surface. Bizimungu attempted to reach his partner with an oar, standing in the boat and driving it downward into the churning water, but the disturbance was already moving beyond his reach. Within seconds, the water began to settle. Wasaja did not resurface. Bizimungu motored back to the landing site and alerted authorities. Local marine police units and wildlife officers reached the area within hours. Wasaja's body was recovered the following day from a submerged embankment roughly 100 yards from the attack site, consistent with crocodile caching behavior. The waterproof pouch containing his phone was still attached to his clothing. Investigators extracted a brief segment of heavily obscured footage and distorted audio from the device. The visual portion consisted largely of muddy water and violent motion blur, with no clear image of the animal. The device was taken into possession by wildlife officers and local police as part of the ongoing inquiry. The footage was not released publicly at the family's request. Nile crocodile attacks account for dozens to possibly hundreds of fatalities annually across sub-Saharan Africa, though exact figures remain unreliable due to widespread underreporting. It was October 14, 2018, when heavy autumn swells pushed turbid water along the north shore of Oahu, Hawaii. Recent storms had stirred sediment from the ocean floor, reducing underwater visibility to less than 10 feet along the outer reef. A confirmed tiger shark sighting earlier that morning had prompted lifeguards to post red warning flags and issue verbal advisories for all swimmers and surfers to exit the water. By mid-morning, most of the regular surf crowd had complied. Tamsin Calloway was a 31-year-old Australian fitness influencer from Sydney's northern beaches, visiting Hawaii on a 3-week content creation trip funded by a sportswear brand. Calloway had built a following of over 200,000 across her platforms through a mix of surf photography, ocean swimming footage, and fitness content filmed in exotic coastal locations. Her brand depended on dramatic ocean imagery, and the North Shore's famous winter swells represented a critical content opportunity. Calloway had arrived at the beach shortly after the advisory was posted. A lifeguard approached her in the parking area and informed her that the water was closed due to a shark sighting and that conditions were dangerous. Calloway told the lifeguard she was from Australia, had grown up surfing around sharks, and that the advisory was an overreaction. She pointed out that several surfers were still visible beyond the break and suggested the closure was not being enforced seriously. The lifeguard repeated the advisory firmly and explained that the remaining surfers had been in the water before the sighting and were being directed to shore. Calloway laughed and told him that Australian beaches stayed open in worse conditions than this. She dismissed him and walked toward the waterline with a borrowed surfboard. A second lifeguard on the tower used a megaphone to direct Calloway not to enter the water. She hesitated briefly at the waterline, scanning the murky surface, then paddled out regardless, moving past the shore break and toward the outer reef approximately 200 yards offshore. Tiger sharks are one of the species most frequently involved in serious shark incidents worldwide, and among the most common culprits in fatal encounters in Hawaiian waters. Adults commonly exceed 12 feet in length and can weigh over 1,400 pounds. Tiger sharks are opportunistic predators that patrol turbid nearshore waters, relying on reduced visibility to approach prey undetected. Their broad, serrated teeth are designed to shear through flesh, bone, and even sea turtle shell. Most attacks involve a single powerful strike from below or behind, though secondary bites have been documented when continued movement in the water draws the shark back. The shark was believed to have been in the area throughout the morning based on multiple sightings. Lifeguards had spotted what they believed to be the same animal twice in the previous 2 hours, estimating its length at over 12 feet. According to witness accounts from surfers who had remained in the water, Calloway had been paddling along the outer reef for approximately 15 minutes when the strike occurred. The shark struck from below, the impact severely, damaging the board and pulling Calloway into the water. Witnesses described a powerful initial strike, followed by a brief secondary bite before the water settled. The injuries were catastrophic. No prolonged feeding behavior was observed, consistent with an investigatory or predatory strike pattern. Lifeguards on jet skis reached the area within 4 minutes. They recovered Calloway floating face down approximately 30 yards from the point of attack. Her left leg had been severed below the knee, and catastrophic bite wounds extended across her hip and lower torso. Massive blood loss had rendered her unresponsive. Emergency medical personnel met the jet ski at the shoreline, but Tamsin Calloway was pronounced dead before reaching the hospital. The investigation confirmed that Calloway had entered the water in direct violation of a posted shark advisory and multiple verbal warnings from lifeguard staff. The shark was never identified or captured. Lifeguards and beach management were cleared of all liability, with investigators noting that every reasonable warning had been issued and deliberately ignored. It was August 9, 2018, at a quiet wildlife park in tropical Queensland, where heat pressed down over still enclosures and dry soil lay undisturbed beneath scattered shade. A low barrier separated visitors from open ground, and the air held a tense stillness, broken only by distant movement beyond the fence. Declan Fossey had built his YouTube channel around wildlife rehabilitation on a 40-acre property outside Bundaberg, Queensland. At 27, he combined hands-on experience with formal training, producing steady content that followed injured animals, relocations, and daily care routines. The channel had grown enough to support his permits and supplement his part-time work at a veterinary clinic. One of his most recognizable animals was Spur, a cassowary raised from a juvenile after losing its mother in a road incident. Because of early human exposure, Spur could not be released and remained in a controlled enclosure with double gate entry and solid fencing. A low internal divider used for feeding created a crossover point staff could step over. Cassowaries are among the most dangerous birds in the world, standing over 6 feet tall and capable of delivering powerful kicks with a dagger-like inner claw. Spur had reached near full size, weighing over 100 pounds, with strong territorial instincts and classified as a high-risk animal under Queensland wildlife guidance. On the morning of the incident, Spur showed signs of agitation, pacing, raised feathers, and low-frequency calls. Recent rain had left the enclosure muddy, reducing traction and making footing unstable near the divider. That afternoon, Declan filmed a milestone video with cameras set outside the enclosure. Spur stayed in the background, moving but not coming closer. Partway through, Declan stepped over the low divider for better lighting, entering without a barrier or tool. As soon as he crossed, Spur's posture changed. Body stiff, head lowered, focused on him. Declan noticed but kept moving, adjusting for the camera. The gap closed in seconds. Spur charged forward. Declan slipped on the wet ground, losing balance and slowing his reaction. The attack followed immediately. Spur leapt forward and delivered a downward kick. The first strike landed to the lower chest and abdomen, the inner claw making contact and penetrating deeply. The force drove Declan backward into the fence line. The impact bent his posture and disrupted his balance, leaving him partially turned and unable to regain stable footing. The claw made a deep cut, slicing through muscle and into his abdomen. It didn't crush. It cut clean but severe. Declan dropped to one knee, trying to steady himself against the fence. Spur shifted to the side, then gave a second shorter kick to the same spot, making the injury worse without staying in contact. After that, Spur backed off a few feet, still watching him but not attacking again. This kind of reaction is typical when the goal is to drive a threat away, not chase it. Declan remained conscious for several seconds. He attempted to stand, placing one hand against the fence, but his movement slowed as internal damage progressed. Penetrating abdominal trauma often presents with delayed external bleeding while internal hemorrhage accelerates. Blood loss began rapidly inside the abdominal cavity, reducing blood pressure and impairing coordination. He took a step along the fence line but collapsed shortly after, unable to maintain balance. His attempts to call out weakened as circulation dropped. Within a minute, his movements became uncoordinated, then minimal. Emergency calls were placed immediately. Workers accessed the enclosure through the double gate system, delaying entry. By the time they reached him, he was unresponsive. Paramedics attempted stabilization before air transport, but his condition deteriorated from internal bleeding. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The coroner confirmed fatal abdominal penetration with major organ damage from a high-force cassowary strike. The enclosure remained intact. Entry occurred through a crossover point without protective measures, with muddy ground contributing to unstable footing. Following the incident, updated protocols were issued for all licensed handlers in the region, requiring physical barriers or tools when inside high-risk enclosures and restricting solo entry during filming. Spur was relocated to a specialized containment facility designed for large, high-risk birds, where access is limited to trained staff under controlled conditions. It was January 14, 2018. The summer rainy season had filled the side channels of a major river system in Zimbabwe to their maximum, pushing water across previously dry sandbanks and flooding the reed beds along the margins to depths that obscured the bottom completely. The current through the narrow seasonal channel ran slow and steady, and the flooded vegetation on both banks reduced visibility to only a few meters in any direction. The air was humid and heavy, with the particular thick warmth that settles over lowland river systems in the wet months, and the water surface carried the opaque brown-green color that makes depth and underwater movement entirely unreadable from above. Canoe safari operators described flooded seasonal channels as a different river entirely. Same water, different rules. Aaron Blake was a 34-year-old logistics manager from Australia who had organized a river-based safari specifically for the canoe component rather than the standard game drive experience. His partner, Helen Blake, 32, had joined the trip on her first African safari. Their guide, Tendai Moyo, 45, had operated canoe safaris on the river for over 12 years and held professional guide qualifications for water-based operations in areas with both hippopotamus and crocodile populations. He was regarded within the regional operator community as one of the more experienced practitioners on that particular river system. The group entered a flooded side channel during the morning session. Tall reed walls lined both margins, and submerged sandbanks forced the canoes away from the shallower edges and into the deeper central current, the reverse of the configuration a guide prefers when moving through a section of river with possible hippopotamus presence. A short distance into the channel, the guide identified clear indicators of animals nearby. Fresh dung sprayed across the reed stems at the waterline, and a pattern of bubbling surface disturbance ahead consistent with a pod resting on the channel floor in the deeper central section. He directed the group immediately toward the shallower margins, where hippos have significantly less maneuvering capacity. The current in the central channel was moving faster than the pace at which the group could reposition, and it carried Aaron and Helen's canoe downstream ahead of the others, placing it between the pod's resting location and the deeper water to which hippos retreat when pressured. The precise configuration guides are trained to identify and avoid above any other. The guide saw it happening. He gave the instruction. The current was faster than the instruction could travel. Hippopotamuses are responsible for a substantial number of human fatalities annually across sub-Saharan Africa and are consistently placed among the continent's most dangerous animals, despite their entirely herbivorous diet. Adult bulls can exceed 3,500 pounds and move through water with a speed and directional precision that bears no resemblance to their appearance on land. Their jaws can open to nearly 150 degrees, and the canine teeth of dominant males can reach lengths sufficient to punch through the bottom of any non-reinforced watercraft. Hippos do not attack in water as a predatory behavior. They attack as a territorial response to a perceived blockage of their movement or escape route. When a canoe or swimmer drifts into the space between a resting hippo and deeper water, the animal's instinct is to clear the obstruction with the full force available to it, and the response is immediate and vertical. Canoes provide no structural resistance to an upward impact from an animal of this mass. I want to be precise about something here. Nobody made a mistake. The current made a decision, and the channel enforced it. A large bull surfaced directly beneath the rear section of the canoe. The impact capsized it instantly and threw both occupants into the channel. The animal continued engaging below the surface, biting repeatedly while the guide repositioned to regroup the scattered group and direct the remaining canoes toward exposed sandbank areas, where the shallow water significantly reduced the hippo's ability to maneuver. Aaron sustained deep bite wounds to his lower back and legs. Helen sustained lacerations and injuries consistent with the capsize impact. Both were recovered from the water and transported by the guide to a vehicle access point where emergency radio contact had been established from the moment the capsize occurred. The investigation confirmed that the capsize resulted from the current carrying the canoe out of its intended position during the guide's repositioning response, rather than from a deliberate decision by any party to enter the area where the pod was resting. Moyo was assessed as having correctly identified the risk and initiated the appropriate response before the incident occurred. the investigation produced updated operational guidance for canoe safari operators in the region, specifically addressing minimum channel width requirements and mandatory current assessment procedures for flooded seasonal routes during the wet season. The regulation that followed was precise because the incident was precise. That is how these documents get written, carefully and too late. It was November 23, 2015, and the northeast monsoon had begun delivering afternoon downpours across Sri Lanka's southern lowlands, greening the scrubby forest and filling seasonal water holes that drew wildlife out of national parks and onto the narrow roads connecting rural villages. Wild elephants moved freely through this landscape, crossing roads, raiding crops, and confronting vehicles on routes that cut through their traditional corridors. Human-elephant conflict was a constant reality, with dozens of fatalities on both sides recorded annually. Radek Skovica was a 29-year-old mechanical engineering graduate from Brno, Czech Republic, 3 months into a solo backpacking trip through South and Southeast Asia. He had rented a small motorbike from a coastal guest house to explore the rural interior independently. Skovica had no prior experience with large wild animals. His social media posts revealed a pattern of risk-taking behavior, including cliff jumping and nighttime rides on unlit roads. On the afternoon in question, Skovica was riding a rented scooter along a narrow road that skirted a national park boundary. The road passed through scrub forest interspersed with small villages and roadside stalls. Hand-painted warning signs in Sinhala and English appeared at irregular intervals. Skovica encountered the elephant at approximately mid-afternoon, according to scene reconstruction. A large adult was standing at the road's edge, pulling at vegetation from a tree overhanging the tarmac. Villagers from a nearby settlement had already stopped at a safe distance, their vehicles clustered roughly 200 yards back. The standard local practice was to wait until the elephant moved on. Several minutes passed with no sign the elephant intended to move. Skovica stopped his scooter, but did not reverse. According to statements from villagers, he dismounted, removed his helmet, and retrieved his phone. He then began walking along the road toward the elephant. Several villagers shouted at him. An older man ran forward, gesturing urgently for him to come back. Skovica either did not understand or chose to ignore them, closing the distance to approximately 40 feet. Asian elephants are among the most powerful animals on Earth, with adults weighing between 6,000 and 11,000 pounds, and standing up to 10 feet at the shoulder. When agitated, an elephant will typically display a sequence of warning behaviors. The head rises, the ears spread wide, and the trunk curls or extends toward the perceived threat. These displays may be followed by a mock charge, a bluff intended to drive the threat away. If the threat persists, the elephant commits to a full charge, reaching speeds of up to around 25 miles per hour, with enough mass to cause fatal injuries in a single impact. The elephant detected Skovica's approach and turned to face him fully. Witnesses described the animal raising its head, spreading its ears wide, and curling its trunk. The behavior matched known warning displays. Skovica continued forward, phone raised. The elephant lunged forward in what witnesses described as a short, sharp movement, a bluff charge intended to drive the man away. When Skovica did not retreat, the elephant committed fully, accelerating across the short distance. Skovica turned to run, but covered only a few steps. According to scene reconstruction by wildlife officers, the elephant knocked him to the ground and trampled him with its weight, before stepping back, trumpeting, and moving off the road into the tree line. Villagers reached Skovica within minutes. His chest and pelvis had been crushed, causing catastrophic internal damage. He appeared unresponsive when the first villagers reached him. An ambulance arrived over an hour later due to the remote location. Skovica was pronounced dead at the scene. The wildlife authorities stated the elephant was believed to be a regular presence in the area, with no known prior incidents involving humans. Officers concluded the animal had responded defensively to a human who had ignored clear warning displays and the urgent warnings of bystanders. No action was taken against the elephant. On March 18, 2018 brought warm, humid weather to Palm Beach County, Florida. Temperatures reached the mid-80s by afternoon, with thick clouds building inland as they typically did during spring. The subtropical climate created perfect conditions for the exotic reptiles housed in climate-controlled facilities that dotted the region's wealthier estates, where private collections of rare and dangerous animals had become a peculiar status symbol among the ultra-wealthy. Marcus LeBlanc, a 49-year-old hedge fund manager, had built his fortune through aggressive investment strategies in emerging markets and technology startups. His success had allowed him to pursue unusual hobbies, including a private reptile collection, housed in a specially constructed building on his waterfront estate. The facility featured individual climate zones, automated monitoring systems, and security measures that rivaled those of professional zoological institutions. LeBlanc had been collecting exotic reptiles for nearly 15 years, gradually acquiring more dangerous specimens as his expertise grew. His collection included venomous snakes, large monitor lizards, and several constrictor species. The crown jewel was a 17-foot reticulated python, one of the longest snake species in the world. Reticulated pythons are native to Southeast Asia and known for their powerful constricting ability. These ambush predators feed on mammals ranging from rats to small deer, killing by wrapping their muscular bodies around prey and tightening their coils each time the victim exhales, eventually causing cardiac arrest through oxygen deprivation. LeBlanc typically employed professional handlers during feeding sessions for his largest snakes. The protocols required 2 people to be present whenever the reticulated python was fed, one managing the snake, the other presenting food using long tongs. On the evening of March 18th, LeBlanc arrived at his reptile facility after the handlers had left for the day. Delayed by a business meeting, he had missed the scheduled feeding time. Rather than waiting until the next day, LeBlanc decided to feed the snake himself. He entered the python's enclosure, a large custom-built space with reinforced glass walls and a secure locking mechanism. LeBlanc carried a thawed rabbit and a pair of long feeding tongs, standard equipment for large constrictors. As LeBlanc extended the rabbit toward the python, the snake struck with lightning-fast reflexes. The python struck the rabbit, missed, and latched onto LeBlanc's arm with its teeth, immediately wrapping coils around him almost instantly. Constrictor snakes possess an instinctive response that causes them to tighten their grip whenever they detect movement or struggle. Once the coiling reflex is triggered, the snake continues applying pressure with each movement it detects. The more the victim struggles, the tighter the constriction becomes. Alone, escape becomes almost impossible. LeBlanc attempted to use his free hand to unwrap the coils, but this only caused the snake to extend its body further, wrapping around his torso. Within seconds, the 17-foot python had established a grip encompassing LeBlanc's arm, chest, and neck. The pressure was immediate and overwhelming. LeBlanc's ribs began to compress, making it difficult to draw breath. He attempted to reach the emergency call button near the enclosure entrance, but the python's weight and constricting force made movement nearly impossible. As his struggles weakened, the python continued to tighten. The snake was simply following millions of years of evolutionary programming, responding to the heat and movement of what it perceived as prey. Each shallow breath LeBlanc managed allowed the coils to tighten further, leaving less room on the next attempt. LeBlanc lost consciousness within approximately 4 minutes. The python maintained its grip for an extended period, as is typical when securing large prey, and continued to hold its position even after LeBlanc's heart stopped. The following morning, professional handlers arriving for their scheduled shift discovered LeBlanc's body still wrapped in the python's coils. It took 3 experienced handlers nearly 30 minutes to safely remove the snake and extract the body from the enclosure. The medical examination confirmed death by asphyxiation due to thoracic compression, with multiple rib fractures and severe internal injuries consistent with constrictor attack. The timeline suggested LeBlanc had been dead for approximately 10 to 12 hours. The investigation found that LeBlanc had violated his own safety protocols by entering the enclosure alone. Security camera footage confirmed no one else had been present during the incident. The reticulated python was seized by wildlife authorities and relocated to a licensed reptile sanctuary. LeBlanc's entire collection was evaluated, and several specimens were found to be held in violation of local exotic animal regulations. The collection was dispersed among licensed facilities and educational institutions. The afternoon of March 3, 2016, brought the kind of calm to Mexico's Pacific coast that makes the water look harmless. The surface ran clear and warm, visibility stretching deep into the reef below. The drop-offs where the shelf fell away into open blue looking from above, like nothing more than a change in color. It was beautiful water. It was also hunting water, and the two things were not unrelated. Miguel Alvarez knew this better than most. He was 44, a veteran spear fisherman who had worked these reefs for over 2 decades, building a reputation up and down the coastline for bringing in larger catches than anyone else and doing it alone. He was lean and weathered in the way that men who spend their lives in the ocean tend to be, unhurried on land, completely at home underwater. Younger fishermen watched the way he moved through the water and understood that it had taken years to look that effortless. What they didn't know was that the effortlessness was under pressure. Financial strain had been building for months, quietly at first, then with an urgency that changed the way Miguel worked. Longer dives, riskier drop-offs, fewer rest days. He had started hunting the reef edges where pelagic species ran deeper and larger, the kind of spots that paid better precisely because they demanded more. His friends had noticed the shift. A few had said something. Miguel had listened politely and gone back, out alone the next morning. On March 3rd, he chose a reef drop-off he knew well, or believed he did. He descended with his spear gun and worked the reef with the efficiency of long practice. Over the course of the dive, he was successful. Several fish, secured to a stringer attached at his waist, trailed behind him as he worked. It was a good day, the kind of day that justified the risk. He didn't notice the silhouette at first. It appeared at the edge of his vision, broad, slow-moving, unhurried in the way that large predators can afford to be. A tiger shark, somewhere around 4 meters, making wide passes at a distance that felt almost respectful. Miguel had seen sharks before. He stayed still, kept his movements controlled, and watched it the way it was watching him. For a time, the standoff held. Then the shark made a low pass. Close, but not striking. Almost casual, the kind of approach that experienced divers recognize as a test. It pulled away and circled again, each pass slightly tighter than the last. The distance between them was shrinking in increments small enough to rationalize but large enough to matter. Miguel made his decision too late. He chose not to release his catch immediately. The fish represented hours of work, real money, a day that had gone well in a stretch of days that hadn't. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, something shifted. By the time he began his ascent, the shark had already closed the distance in a way that left no room for negotiation. The strike came from the side, fast, total, and without the telegraphing that the earlier passes had suggested. A bite to his midsection with the full force of an animal that had made its decision. Miguel was stopped mid-water. The shark pulled away, but the withdrawal was brief. Blood was already spreading through the water in a volume that changed everything around it. What followed was not a structured sequence. It was faster than that, and more chaotic. The shark came back before Miguel had any chance to orient himself. Another contact. Harder, less exploratory. His body was recovered later that afternoon by a fishing vessel working the same stretch of coast. The stringer was still there, the fish he had chosen not to release, still attached to the man who had made that choice. Miguel left behind a wife and 2 teenage sons. It was October 17, 2016, at a residential edge where a private enclosure sat behind aging metal fencing, the ground worn from routine feeding and maintenance, with tools left nearby and the air under overcast skies, giving the space an ordinary calm that masked the risks built into its design. Hana Kobayashi had spent her life on her family's farm in Shibecha, working potato and sugar beet fields across eastern Hokkaido. At 31, she remained closely tied to the land and its animals. In 2014, she found an orphaned Ussuri brown bear cub near a drainage ditch and kept it, feeding it livestock milk replacer instead of reporting it. What began as temporary became routine. As Kumo grew, Hana handled him daily, feeding, cleaning his enclosure, and occasionally leading him short distances with a chain collar. By 2016, he had reached adult size, but was still kept in a makeshift enclosure of fencing and wooden posts, lacking proper reinforced barriers. Despite concerns, Hana continued treating him as a domesticated animal. The farm sat in a valley bordered by dense forest, natural habitat for wild brown bears. Adult males can exceed 600 pounds and deliver powerful forelimb strikes. Kumo, around 450 pounds, was smaller, but still capable of lethal force. By mid-October, bears enter hyperphagia, a feeding phase marked by increased food seeking and reduced tolerance for proximity, even with familiar humans. In the days before the incident, Kumo's behavior changed. He paced along the fence, wore down paths, and vocalized more. During feeding, he positioned himself between Hana and the food, and lingered longer near feeding areas, signs of food guarding that went unaddressed. On October 17th, after the first frost, Hana entered the enclosure around 9:15 a.m. with tools to repair fencing near a water trough. A nearby worker saw her go in, noting Kumo was moving along the far side, watching intermittently. The attack began while Hana knelt at the trough with her back turned. Kumo approached from behind at a steady pace without vocalizing, closing the distance to a few feet before contact. The first strike strike came from above, a downward blow from his forepaw that made contact with the back of her head and upper shoulders. The force drove her forward into the edge of the trough. Such strikes are consistent with documented bear attacks, where forelimb force is used to destabilize. The impact caused immediate loss of balance and disorientation. As she fell, Kumo shifted his weight forward. His jaws followed, clamping onto her head and upper neck. Brown bears typically target the head and neck during attacks, using bite force to incapacitate quickly. The bite applied crushing pressure across the skull and cervical spine. Her attempts to push away were limited by her position beneath his body mass. The attack continued in short, controlled movements. Kumo remained over her, maintaining contact with both forelimbs and jaws. There was no prolonged struggle. Incapacitation often occurs within seconds due to combined blunt force and bite trauma. Movement decreased rapidly, then stopped. Kumo stayed within the enclosure, moving a short distance away but remaining alert. When Hana did not exit, a nearby worker approached and saw her lying beside the trough, with the bear still present. He withdrew immediately and contacted emergency services. Police arrived but could not enter while the bear remained active. Wildlife personnel were called in and used a tranquilizer rifle to sedate Kumo from outside the enclosure. A delay before entry is standard, as sedation takes several minutes to take full effect. Once the animal was immobilized, responders entered. Hana was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner reported severe cranial and cervical trauma, including skull fractures and spinal disruption. The injury pattern, blunt force followed by a crushing bite, is consistent with recorded fatal brown bear attacks. Authorities determined Kumo could not be safely relocated due to habituation and human imprinting, and he was euthanized the following day. The incident led to stricter enforcement of wildlife regulations on privately raised predators. Hana's death highlighted the risk of keeping a wild apex animal in confinement, where early familiarity does not persist into adulthood, especially during seasonal feeding periods. It was March 23, 2016, when a private safari jeep wound along the fixed trail system of a tiger reserve in Rajasthan's Ranthambore region. The dry season had stripped the forest to brittle scrub and exposed sandstone, visibility broken by shallow ravines and thorn bush. The reserve operated under strict regulations. All vehicles followed designated routes. Off-road driving was prohibited by law, and each jeep was assigned a park-certified naturalist. Venetia Calcroft was a 54-year-old British property consultant who had lived in Dubai for the previous 8 years. Her considerable income had funded wildlife photography trips across East Africa and Southeast Asia, and she maintained a growing portfolio she hoped to exhibit commercially. Calcroft had booked a private safari vehicle at a premium rate, paying roughly 4 times the standard group fare. Her assigned naturalist, Devrath Kulhari, 33, had guided in the reserve for over 7 years and held one of the park's most experienced ratings. Kulhari had positioned the jeep along a ridgeline trail overlooking a dry riverbed, where a resident tigress and her 2 cubs had been sighted intermittently over the previous week. Calcroft had grown increasingly frustrated over the first 2 days of the safari, having managed only distant sightings. She had complained to the lodge manager on the first evening, demanding a different naturalist who would be more accommodating. When Kulhari stopped the jeep at the ridgeline overlook and pointed out fresh pug marks along the ravine below, Calcroft demanded he drive off trail and descend toward the riverbed. Kulhari explained that off-road driving was a criminal offense within the reserve and that his license would be revoked. Calcroft dismissed this, telling him she would report him to park authorities and file a formal complaint that could cost him future bookings. Kulhari maintained his refusal. Calcroft retrieved her camera bag and stepped out of the jeep. Kulhari immediately told her to get back inside, warning that a tigress with cubs had been using the ravine and that leaving the vehicle on foot was both illegal and potentially fatal. Calcroft waved him off. She paused briefly at the edge of the slope, glancing back toward the jeep, then began descending the rocky slope toward the scrub-choked riverbed, roughly 80 yards below the trail. Bengal tigers are among the most powerful predators on the Indian subcontinent, with adult females weighing between 220 and 350 pounds. Despite their size, tigresses move through dense cover with near-complete silence, capable of closing short distances almost instantly. A mother tiger's defensive aggression toward perceived threats to her cubs is among the most dangerous scenarios in wildlife encounters. Their attack relies on explosive ambush from concealment, typically targeting the throat with powerful jaws designed to clamp down and suffocate prey. According to investigators who reconstructed the scene, Calcroft had descended approximately 50 yards from the jeep when the attack occurred. The tigress had been concealed in a patch of dry scrub less than 20 feet from the path Calcroft was following. Evidence at the scene indicated the animal struck from the side, targeting the throat and neck. The initial bite likely caused severe trauma and rapid loss of mobility. The force of the impact impact carried Calcroft to the ground. Kulhari reported hearing a brief, cut-off cry followed by silence. He radioed park control immediately. By the time a ranger patrol reached the riverbed approximately 20 to 30 minutes later, the tigress had dragged Calcroft's body into dense cover near the ravine floor. There was no clear evidence of feeding. The tigress remained in defensive control of the area until disturbed. Rangers recovered the body after the tigress was driven off with vehicle noise and firecrackers. The park investigation confirmed that Calcroft had exited the vehicle and entered a restricted area on foot in direct violation of reserve regulations. Kulhari was cleared of any liability. The tigress and her cubs were monitored but not harmed, as the attack was classified as a natural defensive response. It was July 4th, 2016 dawned with spectacular weather across the Serengeti in Tanzania. The morning air was crisp and clear, with temperatures in the low 70s and not a cloud visible in the brilliant blue sky. The dry season had transformed the landscape into an endless expanse of golden grassland, broken only by scattered kopjes, ancient granite outcroppings that jutted from the plains like islands rising from a sea of grass. It was exactly the kind of morning that makes a $12,000 per person price tag feel entirely justified. Victoria Langford, a 32-year-old property investor from London, had accumulated substantial wealth through strategic real estate acquisitions across the United Kingdom. Her portfolio included commercial properties in prime locations, generating passive income that allowed her to travel extensively. This particular safari package had cost nearly $12,000 per person, promising luxury accommodations and exclusive game viewing experiences. Langford had arrived at the park 4 days earlier as part of a small group tour. She had spent her time photographing elephants, giraffes, and various antelope species, but had grown increasingly frustrated with the mandatory distance requirements enforced by the guides. She had expressed multiple times that photos from the required safe distances lacked the dramatic impact she wanted for her social media accounts. On the afternoon of July 4th, the safari vehicle stopped approximately 80 meters from a pride of African lions resting in tall grass near a seasonal waterhole. The guide explained that the pride consisted of 2 adult males, several females, and multiple cubs, and emphasized that everyone must remain inside the vehicle at all times. The group spent nearly 20 minutes photographing the pride from the safety of the Land Cruiser. Most of the lions appeared to be sleeping, their bodies sprawled in the shade of scattered acacia trees, tails flicking lazily at flies. The scene looked almost peaceful, the kind of stillness that could easily make an inexperienced observer forget what they were looking at. The guide was occupied answering questions from other tourists, his attention divided among the 6 passengers. Langford quietly opened the rear door of the vehicle and stepped out onto the dusty ground. She moved slowly and deliberately, keeping her eyes on the distant lions as she walked several meters from the Land Cruiser, her phone already positioned for a selfie with the pride visible in the background. What Langford failed to notice was that one of the younger male lions, approximately 3 years old and weighing roughly 300 pounds, had been lying in grass tall enough to completely conceal his body. His position placed him much closer to the tourists than anyone realized. The moment Langford began walking, the young male's predatory instincts activated. Lions are hardwired to respond to movement, particularly when an animal separates itself from a group. In the wild, an animal that breaks from the herd is almost always vulnerable, injured, sick, or disoriented. To a lion, that separation is a signal refined over millions of years of evolution. The lion rose silently from his concealed position and began stalking toward Langford from behind, his body low to the ground and his movements fluid and deliberate. By the time the guide noticed what was happening, the lion had already closed more than half the distance. His shouted warnings only caused Langford to turn around, putting her in direct eye contact with the approaching predator. Lions typically hunt by stalking close before launching a final explosive charge. They can accelerate from a standstill to 35 miles per hour in just a few seconds, covering short distances faster than any human can react. Their strategy relies on surprise and overwhelming physical force. The young male charged the final 20 meters in less than 3 seconds. Langford attempted to run back toward the vehicle, but the predator was on her before she managed 2 steps. The lion's front paws struck her back with tremendous force, driving her face first into the ground. The guide slammed the vehicle into gear and accelerated toward the lion while leaning on the horn, as other tourists screamed and banged on the sides of the Land Cruiser. The noise and commotion caused the young male to pause momentarily, but he maintained his position over Langford's body. The guide continued driving directly at the lion, closing the distance while shouting through the open window. The combination of the approaching vehicle and sustained human noise finally triggered the lion's retreat instinct. The predator released Langford and trotted back toward the pride. The guide and another tourist pulled Langford back into the vehicle. She had sustained massive injuries to her back, shoulders, and neck from the lion's claws and initial bite. The guide immediately radioed for emergency evacuation while applying pressure to the worst of the wounds. A medical helicopter arrived within 35 minutes, landing in a clearing several hundred meters from the attack site. Langford remained conscious, but was going into shock from blood loss and trauma. Medical personnel stabilized her during the flight to the nearest trauma center. Despite extensive surgical intervention, Langford died from her injuries approximately 6 hours after the attack. Extreme blood loss and trauma to vital structures proved too severe to overcome. The investigation placed full responsibility on Langford for violating clearly stated safety regulations. The guide was cleared of any wrongdoing, though the safari company implemented additional physical barriers on all vehicles to prevent passengers from opening doors during game viewing. It was August 7, 2012. The winter dry season in a private game reserve in the South African Lowveld had reduced the bush to minimal leaf cover, and the ravine systems cutting through the reserve's terrain were dense with dry brush, dead vegetation, and deep shadow well before sundown. The air that evening carried the sharp cold that descends over the Lowveld rapidly after the sun drops, and visibility inside the ravine system had already deteriorated significantly by the time the crew's vehicle reached the area. The dry channel floor and its surrounding brush provided almost no sightline beyond a few meters in any direction. Lowveld cold arrives without warning. One moment, the light is workable. Then the temperature drops, the shadows flatten, and everything inside the ravine becomes the same shade of dark. Trevor Hale was a 55-year-old documentary filmmaker from the United Kingdom, whose career had spanned over 2 decades of natural history production work across multiple continents. He had built a professional reputation on close-range wildlife footage and approached each assignment with the specific goal of obtaining sequences that standard game drive access could not produce. His wife, Nina Hale, 50, worked as his producer and had collaborated with him across the full span of his professional career. The tracker assigned to their vehicle, Sifo Dlamini, 39, had worked in the reserve for over a decade and held detailed knowledge of the terrain, the resident animal territories, and the individual behavioral patterns of the leopards monitored within the reserve's boundaries. He carried a professional field guide qualification and was certified to operate in areas with dangerous game. The crew had been tracking a mature male leopard that had made a kill on an impala and was progressively dragging the carcass deeper into a dry ravine system as vultures gathered on exposed branches above, and hyenas tested the perimeter from the bush margins. As daylight faded and the available light quality for filming degraded, Trevor indicated that losing the sequence entirely was a significant concern for the production. The tracker advised that visibility inside the ravine had dropped to a point where the leopard's exact position could not be reliably established from the vehicle, and that continuing to approach the area without knowing where the animal was relative to the carcass presented a serious and specific risk. The vehicle remained at its position above the ravine edge. 2 decades of production work. He had been in situations like this before and come away with the footage. I think that history is part of what made the next decision feel reasonable to him. While adjusting a camera angle at the side of the vehicle, Trevor moved several meters downslope into thicker brush without the movement being registered as a significant departure by the tracker or the rest of the crew. By the time his positioning was fully apparent, he had placed himself between the leopard's location beside the carcass and the natural exit route the animal would use to leave the ravine. Leopards are pound for pound among the most powerful large predators on the African continent. Adult males can reach 200 pounds and are capable of hauling carcasses significantly heavier than themselves vertically up tree trunks. They are ambush hunters by design, built for explosive short-range contact rather than sustained pursuit, and their muscular density relative to body size exceeds that of any other large African cat. When feeding on a kill, a leopard becomes intensely defensive of the carcass, and any perceived threat at close range triggers an immediate short-charge response. Before the animal withdraws, the geometry of most leopard attacks at kill sites follows a consistent pattern. A human who inadvertently positions between a feeding leopard and its exit route removes the animal's option to retreat and collapses its defensive threshold entirely. At distances under 5 meters, a leopard's attack is complete before any human reflex sequence can initiate a protective response. That geometry is what I keep returning to. Trevor did not approach the leopard. He accidentally removed its ability to leave. Those are not the same thing, and the distinction matters. The leopard, positioned less than 5 meters from Trevor beside the carcass, launched a short-range defensive ambush charge. The animal struck Trevor and drove him backward down the slope before retreating once the tracker and the rest of the crew advanced together toward the disturbance. The leopard did not re-engage. Trevor sustained significant lacerations to the upper body and shoulder, and a serious wound consistent with the initial contact impact. He was extracted to the vehicle and transported under emergency protocols to the nearest available medical response point. The investigation determined that Trevor had moved beyond the vehicle's immediate perimeter without the tracker's knowledge and had positioned himself at the kill site's critical choke point during deteriorating light conditions. Dlamini was cleared of any negligence. The reserve suspended operations in the affected section for a period of 48 hours and issued updated crew protocols establishing minimum required distances from active kill sites after sundown, applicable to all production teams operating within the reserve. It was July 13, 2014, in a quiet residential backyard in Atherton, where late afternoon sunlight settled across trimmed grass and wooden fencing. Toys lay scattered across the yard, and a side gate near the fence line sat slightly misaligned, its latch not fully secured. Benoit Harcourt had spent 8 years working at a wildlife sanctuary before moving to a rural property outside Atherton in 2009. His experience with non-domestic animals shaped how he managed Kiro, an adult male chimpanzee he kept in a reinforced enclosure. Weighing over 120 pounds, Kiro had the strength and unpredictability typical of great apes. Benoit followed strict containment rules, limiting direct interaction and relying on separation systems designed to prevent direct contact. The enclosure reflected that caution: 8-foot steel fencing, a concrete base, and a double-gate entry system. The inner gate used a spring-loaded latch that had begun sticking in humid conditions. Benoit had already planned to replace it, but it had not yet been fixed. That afternoon, guests gathered for a children's birthday party. Movement increased across the yard. Running, shouting, shifting patterns of motion. Cairo had been active earlier, moving along the enclosure and reacting to the noise, behavior consistent with heightened arousal in captive primates exposed to stimulation. At around 3:15 p.m., Benoit noticed the inner gate slightly open. The latch had failed, and Kiro moved through without hesitation. His movement into the yard was controlled, but alert, reacting to kids running, noise, and movement. Benoit stepped in front of him, placing himself between Cairo and the nearest group. He raised his voice in a familiar way, trying to redirect him. Kiro paused, but only briefly. His focus locked onto Benoit, and his body didn't relax. His shoulders lifted, arms hung forward, and his stance stiffened, clear signs of rising tension. Benoit held his position, trying not to make sudden moves, but Kiro started coming toward him. At first it looked controlled, slow steps, steady eye contact, but halfway in, it changed. His body tensed, his head lowered slightly, and his pace sped up. The shift was sudden. Then he lunged. The hit landed high on Benoit's chest and shoulders, pushing him backward and knocking him off balance right away. Before he could recover, Kiro was already on him, grabbing and dragging him to the ground. They hit hard, and there was no space between them after that. Kiro stayed on top, leaning his weight forward. His hands came down in quick, repeated hits while he pushed in to bite. The first bites landed on Benoit's arms as he tried to protect himself, then moved to the shoulder and upper chest when his guard dropped. Each bite was fast and strong, clamping down and pulling before shifting again. The hits didn't stop, keeping him pinned the whole time. Benoit tried to push him off, pressing against his shoulders and neck, but it didn't work. Every move was stopped right away. When he turned to one side, Kiro followed. When he tried to roll, the grip tightened and pulled him back down. The attack stayed close and non-stop, with no break to get away. The ground made it harder to move. Every shift gave Kiro more control. His grip kept changing. Hands, then bite, then hands again, never staying in one place long enough to break free. Within minutes, Benoit's movement slowed. His arms dropped lower, no longer able to block effectively. His reactions became delayed, then uneven. The resistance faded as blood loss and shock set in. Kiro continued for a short time after that, then stopped once Benoit no longer moved. He stepped away, breathing hard, but stayed nearby, watching and alert, as the yard went still again. Emergency services were called right away. People tried to help Benoit, but his condition got worse quickly. He lost consciousness before responders arrived and was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner confirmed he died from severe injuries, including heavy tissue damage, major blood loss, and blunt force trauma consistent with a chimpanzee attack. Bite wounds were found across his upper body, but the cause of death was the combined effect of the injuries and bleeding. Kiro was secured by animal control and later euthanized following a legal review. Investigators identified the failed latch and the high stimulation environment as contributing factors, showing how a controlled setting shifted into a fatal encounter within seconds. It was July 14, 2017, and the dry season had settled across the western shore of a large lake in Uganda's Rift Valley region. Water levels had dropped noticeably, exposing muddy banks and concentrating hippopotamus pods into increasingly crowded pools along the river channels that fed the lake. A small ecotourism lodge near the lakeshore offered guided canoe safaris along a stretch of river channel known for waterbird concentrations, with strict protocols to maintain distance from hippopods in deeper sections. Dawson Creel was a 31-year-old fitness instructor from Durban, South Africa, who had spent the previous 3 weeks traveling overland through East Africa with his partner. Creel was physically imposing, competitive, and accustomed to outdoor endurance activities. He had completed several multi-day kayaking expeditions along the South African coastline and considered himself an experienced paddler. The morning excursion carried Creel, his partner, and 2 other guests in 2-person canoes led by a local guide in a separate craft. The guide, a 33-year-old man who had grown up in a fishing village on the lake, conducted a thorough safety briefing before departure. The planned route followed a controlled section of the river channel where hippo activity was minimal, with a clearly marked turnaround point, beyond which the channel narrowed and hippopods were known to congregate. The group was to remain in formation at all times. No canoe was to move ahead of the guide's craft under any circumstances. The first hour passed without incident. The group moved slowly along the channel, observing waterbirds and a pod of hippos visible as dark, rounded shapes in a deeper pool roughly 200 yards ahead. The guide adjusted the group's course and signaled the turnaround. Creel had been growing restless. According to his partner and the other guests, he had made several comments about the conservative pace. He told the guide he had paddled alongside seals and dolphins in South Africa, and that this distance was unnecessary. The guide explained that hippos were territorial, aggressive, and responsible for more human deaths in Africa than most other large animals. Creel dismissed him. As the group began turning back, Creel broke formation. He paddled his canoe past the turnaround marker and directly toward the deeper section of the channel where the pod was concentrated, including several calves visible alongside their mothers. The guide shouted after him, but could not physically close the distance before Creel had entered the restricted stretch of water. Hippopotamuses are among Africa's most dangerous large animals and one of the leading causes of wildlife-related deaths on the continent. Adult males weigh between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds and can exceed 14 feet in length. Despite their bulk, hippos are capable of explosive movement in water, surging from beneath or beside a target with speed that outpaces any swimmer or small vessel. Their massive jaws can open nearly 180 degrees, revealing lower canine teeth that can exceed a foot in length, capable of crushing bone and shearing flesh with enormous force. Territorial males become extraordinarily aggressive during the dry season when shrinking water forces pods into tight quarters. A large adult hippo surged upward beside Creel's canoe some distance beyond the turnaround marker, capsizing it with its body and jaws and dumping Creel into shallow water at the reed line. The hippo submerged briefly, then charged through the shallows. Creel attempted to scramble toward the bank but had barely turned before the animal was on him. The hippo's jaws clamped onto his torso, crushing and tearing with enormous force before lifting and tossing him back into the shallows. Witnesses described the animal re-engaging, driving him beneath the surface. After a brief but violent struggle, the disturbance in the water subsided. The guide screamed at the remaining paddlers to reverse and shepherded the group back down the channel. He radioed the lodge, and a motorized rescue boat arrived approximately 30 minutes later. Creel's body was recovered from the shallows that afternoon after wildlife rangers confirmed the pod had moved to deeper water. The cause of death was determined to be massive crushing trauma to the chest and torso, combined with drowning. The lodge suspended all canoe excursions pending investigation. Wildlife authorities confirmed the area beyond the turnaround marker had been a known hippo congregation point and was clearly off-limits to guided groups. The guide was cleared of responsibility after witness testimony confirmed the victim had violated explicit instructions. It was April 8, 2014, and the Sundarbans mangrove forest along Bangladesh's southern coast had entered the peak honey harvesting season. Permitted crews of Mawalis ventured deep into a landscape where Bengal tigers had preyed on humans for centuries. Rafiqul Mullah, a 47-year-old Mawali from a village on the forest's northern fringe, had collected honey in the Sundarbans for over 25 years. Mullah had learned the trade from his father, who had worked the same tidal channels before him, and was regarded among his peers as one of the most skilled collectors in the district. He knew the forest's shifting tidal patterns, the location of productive hive clusters across seasons, and the warning signs that preceded tiger encounters. He was among the most experienced members of his crew, a group of 7 men who entered the forest under a seasonal permit issued by the Regional Forest Authority. The crew traveled by wooden boat along the narrow tidal channels, stopping at known collection sites and working in pairs or small groups to locate and harvest hives. The Forest Authority had recorded an increase in tiger encounters that season, attributing the trend to shifting activity patterns in the Western Range. Mala's crew had been briefed on the elevated risk and instructed to maintain group cohesion at all times. Each man carried rudimentary protective equipment, including a clay mask worn on the back of the head, based on a traditional belief that tigers are less likely to attack prey that appears to be facing them. On the day of the incident, Mala's crew had anchored near a dense stand of giwa trees approximately 3 hours into the forest by boat. The tide was low, exposing slick mud banks along the channel edges and narrowing the navigable waterway to a corridor barely wide enough for the boat. The air was heavy and still, thick with humidity and the smell of tidal decay. The crew split into smaller groups to work adjacent collection sites. Mala moved ahead of his nearest partner to inspect a hive he had spotted in the upper canopy of a tree roughly 50 yards from the water's edge. His partner remained at the previous collection point. Mala carried a basic feature phone in his shirt pocket. He had been using it intermittently throughout the morning to record short voice notes about hive locations, a habit his crew members later confirmed, and investigators believe the device was still in an active recording state when he approached the final tree. Bengal tigers are the apex predator of the Sundarban's ecosystem, uniquely adapted to hunting in tidal mangrove terrain. Adult males weigh between 400 and 500 pounds, with females averaging 250 to 350 pounds. Tigers in the Sundarbans have developed specialized hunting behaviors distinct from their counterparts in grassland or dry forest habitats, including swimming between islands, stalking through waist-deep water, and attacking from dense root systems where visibility is measured in feet rather than yards. Their ambush strategy relies on approaching from behind, closing to within a single leap before striking. The killing bite targets the back of the neck or throat, crushing the windpipe or, in rare cases, damaging the cervical spine. The Sundarban's tiger population is responsible for a historically significant number of human fatalities, though modern annual fatality figures have declined significantly compared to historical averages due to reduced forest access and increased monitoring. Based on the crew's subsequent testimony and the Forest Authority's examination of the site, Mala had moved beyond visual contact with his nearest crew member when the attack occurred. His partner reported hearing a sudden, sharp crash through the undergrowth, followed by a brief vocalization that was cut short almost immediately. Then silence. The crew shouted Mola's name repeatedly and received no response. When they converged on his last known position, they found deep impressions in the soft mud where something heavy had struck the ground, drag marks leading into the root system, and Mola's harvesting tools scattered at the base of the tree. The drag trail continued for some distance before disappearing into a flooded channel where the mud gave way to standing water. The crew did not follow. Mala's phone was recovered from the mud near the collection site. Data extraction revealed a fragmented recording left running during his approach to the hive. The audio captured ambient forest sounds, then a sudden eruption of noise, heavy impact through vegetation, brief chaotic disturbance, and then silence. The device was recovered face down in the mud, and a few seconds of distorted visual footage near the end of the recording showed only motion blur and ground before cutting out. A response team from the Forest Authority, accompanied by armed wildlife guards, entered the area within hours. Mala's remains were recovered approximately 200 yards from the collection site, partially concealed in dense undergrowth. The condition of the remains was consistent with a large predator kill. The authority confiscated the phone and all recovered materials, retaining them as part of ongoing efforts to determine whether the attack was part of a pattern. The footage and audio were not released publicly. Back on May 11th, 2015, the afternoon heat in the Texas Hill Country had pushed past 90 degrees and settled there, the kind of dry, pressing heat that radiates off concrete and corrugated metal and makes the air above the ground shimmer at the edges. The property sat outside a small town west of San Antonio, a single-story house with a converted outbuilding set back from it, connected by a short gravel path. From the road, the outbuilding looked like a workshop. Inside, it was climate-controlled, purpose-built, and meticulously organized. Enclosures lined the walls, temperature gauges, feeding logs, the kind of facility that takes years to build correctly and reflects the person who built it. Marissa Velarde was 34, a reptile breeder who had worked with exotic animals privately for over a decade. In Texas, large constrictors fall into a regulatory gray area, legal to own in most counties with minimal formal oversight, the rules varying enough from one jurisdiction to the next that experienced keepers largely self-governed. Marissa was one of them. She had handled large constrictors hundreds of times. Her children had grown up around the facility and were familiar with its routines. She was not careless in the general sense of the word. She was experienced, knowledgeable, and had a safety record that reflected both of those things. What she had also developed over years of uneventful handling was a tolerance for risk that had quietly outpaced her caution, the kind of drift that happens in small increments, each one feeling reasonable at the time, none of them feeling like the last step before something goes wrong. The morning had been routine. She had checked temperatures, updated feeding logs, and moved through the facility the way she always did, methodically, without rushing. Her children had been in and out of the outbuilding throughout the day, watching from doorways the way they always did, familiar enough with the animals to be comfortable and young enough to not fully understand what comfortable around these animals actually meant. By early afternoon, she was down to the last enclosure on her list. The snake was a reticulated python she had owned for 9 years, 16 feet long, well-fed, and that afternoon, alert, its head raised, actively tracking her movement before she had even opened the enclosure door. Marissa noted it and went in anyway. She did not bring a hook tool. She did not call for a second handler. Her children were visible through the doorway to the adjacent room. Reticulated pythons are the longest snakes in the world, with large individuals exceeding 20 feet and 200 pounds. They kill by constriction, anchoring a bite and coiling around the target, tightening incrementally with each exhale until breathing becomes impossible. The pressure a large python generates is sufficient to fracture ribs. They are not aggressive by default, but they are not domesticated animals. Handlers in private reptile circles widely recognize that any snake over 8 feet requires 2 people present during direct contact. Not for beginners, for everyone. The python struck without any of the hesitation that 9 years of handling might suggest it had learned. It anchored a bite on her right forearm, the strike fast and precise. The teeth curved inward so that pulling away only deepened the hold, and in the same motion began to coil. The first loop came around her arm and upper torso before she had fully registered the bite. The second followed within seconds, the snake's body moving with a speed and deliberateness that experienced handlers describe as the moment the situation stops being recoverable. Marissa called for help immediately, her voice controlled, instructing her children to go get someone. Her older child turned and ran toward the house. Her younger one stayed in the doorway and did not move, watching. The coils tightened. A reticulated python does not squeeze continuously. It tightens incrementally, taking up slack with each exhale, each breath slightly shallower than the last, the space inside the coils decreasing with a patience that has nothing to do with patience and everything to do with physics. By the third exhale, the compression on her chest was measurable. By the fifth, it was the only thing that mattered. Marissa kept calling out, shorter words now, tighter, each one harder to push out than the last. Her voice changed in a way that had nothing to do with panic and everything to do with the simple mechanical fact of her chest having less room than it had a moment before. The younger child stood in the doorway and watched her mother's face change color. Then it stopped. Emergency responders arrived and removed the snake. Marissa Velarde was pronounced dead at the scene. Her older child had reached a neighbor 2 properties down. The call to emergency services was made from that neighbor's phone. Her case was subsequently referenced in reptile handling circles and private keeper training materials as an example of what solo handling of a large constrictor looks like when it goes wrong. The failures identified were consistent and unambiguous. A snake of that size, handled alone, without tools, in an active behavioral state. Each factor individually increases risk. Together, they produced an outcome that experienced handlers, when asked about it, tended to describe the same way: foreseeable. The facility was closed. The animals were transferred to a private sanctuary 3 hours north of the property. Marissa's 2 children were taken in by her sister, who lived in Austin. The outbuilding sat empty for the rest of that summer. The climate control kept running, holding the temperature exactly where Marissa had always kept it, for weeks after there was no longer any reason to. It was November 9th, 2014, brought oppressive heat and humidity to the floodplain wetlands near Kakadu National Park in Australia's Northern Territory. Temperatures had reached 95 degrees by late afternoon, with the approaching wet season leaving the tidal river system swollen with recent rainfall. The air was thick and still, carrying the smell of mud and vegetation that characterizes the region's transitional season, that uncomfortable stretch of weeks when the heat becomes almost unbearable, but the rains have not yet arrived to break it. Gregory Halstead, a 54-year-old mining executive, had accumulated substantial wealth through leadership positions in several major mineral extraction operations across Australia. His success had allowed him to purchase a luxury property along a tidal river system connected to the wetlands, featuring a private dock with stunning views of the surrounding wilderness. Halstead had owned the property for approximately 3 years, using it as a weekend retreat. The area was well known for its large population of saltwater crocodiles, and warning signs had been installed along the riverbank by wildlife authorities, clearly stating the danger and advising against entering the water. The Northern Territory's Wildlife Management Agency maintained records of multiple fatal attacks in the region over the previous decade. Despite these warnings, Halstead had developed a habit of cooling off in the river during hot evenings. He had done so dozens of times without incident, creating a false sense of security. Halstead had convinced himself that the crocodiles in his section of the river were either absent or accustomed to his presence, reasoning that collapses entirely when measured against the behavior of saltwater crocodiles, which are patient, observant, and entirely indifferent to human assumptions. Saltwater crocodiles are among the most dangerous predators on Earth. These massive reptiles can grow to lengths exceeding 20 feet and weights of over 2,000 pounds. They are ambush hunters that can remain motionless in water for hours, and their bite force exceeds 3,700 pounds per square inch, the strongest of any living animal. On the evening of November 9th, Halstead returned to his property after a particularly stressful week. The heat was unbearable, and the air conditioning was malfunctioning, so he headed down to the dock just after sunset, around 7:30 p.m., a particularly dangerous time, as saltwater crocodiles are most active during twilight hours and after dark. He waited out until he was waist-deep approximately 10 feet from the dock. The water was warm and murky, with visibility extending only a few inches below the surface. What Halstead could not see was the saltwater crocodile positioned motionless in deeper water nearby, estimated at over 14 feet in length and 1,200 pounds. Crocodiles are known to learn the patterns of potential prey, returning to locations where animals regularly enter the water. The attack came without warning. The crocodile launched itself upward from below the surface in an explosive vertical strike, its jaws clamping down on Halstead's torso with devastating force. The predator started dragging Halstead into a deeper section of the water before immediately spinning its body, a behavior known as the death roll, to disorient prey, tear flesh, and drag victims underwater. Halstead was pulled beneath the surface within seconds. The crocodile maintained its grip while continuing to roll, causing catastrophic injuries to his torso and limbs. The murky water turned dark with blood. A neighbor walking along the riverbank approximately 200 meters away heard the disturbance, a brief cry followed by a heavy splash that carried clearly through the still evening air. By the time they reached a vantage point near Halstead's dock, there was no sign of him, only ripples spreading outward across the otherwise calm water. Emergency services were contacted immediately, and police and wildlife rangers arrived within 20 minutes. The search continued through the night using spotlights and boats, but the murky water and extensive mangrove systems made the effort extremely difficult. 3 days later, Halstead's remains were discovered approximately 800 meters downstream, cached underwater beneath a submerged log. Typical behavior for saltwater crocodiles that store large prey to feed on over several days. Wildlife rangers tracked and captured a large male crocodile matching the estimated size of the attacker. Examination confirmed it had recently fed on a large mammal, and following standard protocols for crocodiles involved in fatal attacks on humans, the animal was euthanized. The investigation revealed that Halstead had been repeatedly warned by neighbors and local authorities about the danger of entering the water. Property records showed that warning signs had been installed on his dock by the previous owner, though Halstead had removed them at some point. It was September 3, 2019. The late dry season in a game reserve in western Zambia had stripped the bush to its minimum. The vegetation was a compressed tangle of gray thorn scrub and dust-covered elephant paths, dense enough in places to reduce sight lines to under 10 meters. The air was still and dry, carrying scent further than usual, and the ground around a shrinking water source nearby was layered with fresh tracks from every major species in the region. The conditions were exactly those in which experienced guides exercise the most caution. I think that is worth holding on to. The conditions themselves were a warning, and the guide read every part of them correctly. Michael Torres was a 52-year-old retired professional from the United States who had dedicated a substantial portion of his retirement to international wildlife travel. He had participated in guided safaris across multiple African countries over the preceding years and considered himself a practiced and comfortable participant in bushwalking activities. His traveling companion, Naomi Reed, 48, a committed wildlife enthusiast from the same country, had selected the walking component of the itinerary, specifically for the close-range nature experience it offered. Their guide, Patrick Zulu, 44, had led walking safaris in the reserve for over 15 years, carried a legally licensed firearm as required for all guides operating on foot in areas with dangerous game, and was regarded as one of the more experienced practitioners in the region. Walking safari guiding carries a category of responsibility that has no direct equivalent in vehicle-based operations. A game drive vehicle functions as a physical and olfactory barrier between guests and the surrounding wildlife. Animals that would respond aggressively to a human figure on foot often treat a stationary vehicle as a neutral feature of the landscape. On foot, that barrier is absent entirely. What replaces it is the guide's continuous environmental assessment: track age, scent direction, bird behavior, vegetation density, wind shift. The reserve's walking program operated on the strength of that assessment, and the guests behind Zulu on any given morning were entirely dependent on it functioning without interruption. The group moved through dense brush along an elephant path toward the water source. Within a short distance, the guide identified a sequence of environmental warning indicators arriving in close succession. Fresh buffalo dung with insect activity still present on the surface, a small group of oxpeckers lifting suddenly and without apparent cause from low vegetation ahead, and the heavy livestock-like musk of buffalo drifting through the still air from a direction that placed animals nearby. He directed the group to close their spacing immediately and begin a controlled backward withdrawal from the area. Torres, who had drifted slightly to one side while attempting to photograph movement in the scrub, stepped off the designated path and partially separated his position from the rest of the group. A few meters, that is all it was. In that bush, at that moment, it was enough. A solitary old buffalo bull had been resting in the shade of dense cover at close range. The animal came out of concealment without an extended approach warning. The distance between the bull and the group at the moment of the charge was short enough that the guide had time only to raise his voice before contact occurred. African buffalo are consistently listed among the most dangerous animals on the continent, and for reasons that are frequently underestimated by those encountering them for the first time. Solitary old bulls, animals that have been expelled from the main herd and spend their days resting in thick cover, are specifically more dangerous than herd animals, exhibiting a pronounced aggression that experienced guides treat with more caution than almost any other buffalo encounter type. An adult bull can exceed 1,500 pounds and carries horns that fuse at the skull base into a solid bone mass, capable of delivering impacts that fracture vehicle bodywork. A charging buffalo uses its horns to hook, toss, and pin rather than simply to ram, and animals that charge from concealment at close range leave almost no margin for any protective response. They are also documented to double back and re-engage after an initial charge, a behavior that makes the period immediately following impact as dangerous as the impact itself. That last detail is the one guides fear most. The first charge ends the encounter for most animals. The buffalo sometimes comes back. The animal went straight to him and drove him into thorn scrub before veering back into heavy vegetation. The guide discharged a warning shot only after the initial impact, consistent with standard protocol in close-range encounters, where firing before contact risks redirecting the charge direction in a way that cannot be controlled. Torres sustained puncture and blunt force injuries. The group was extracted from the area under the guide's direction. Emergency protocols were activated at the nearest vehicle access point. The investigation confirmed that Torres had separated from the group against the guide's instruction during an active withdrawal in an area where multiple clear warning indicators were present and had been acknowledged by the guide in real time. The guide was cleared of any negligence. The reserve reviewed its pre-walk briefing protocols with specific attention to group spacing management in dense vegetation sections following the conclusion of the investigation. The day was July 19, 2016. The trail moved through mixed pine and aspen forest in the foothills west of Colorado Springs, the kind of terrain that looks approachable from the trailhead and quietly becomes something wilder the further in you go. It was mid-afternoon. The light came through the canopy in long, broken columns. The air was dry and warm, and the forest on either side of the trail was dense enough that visibility into the undergrowth dropped to 10 or 15 feet before it became shadow and brush and nothing else. Elena Navarro was 36, a physical therapist from Colorado Springs, who hiked regularly and brought her 2 young sons along on trails she knew well. She was not reckless. She kept her children close. She had walked this particular trail multiple times without incident, and nothing about the afternoon suggested that this time would be any different. It was a weekend. The boys were out of school. It was the kind of ordinary afternoon that families in Colorado spend outdoors without thinking twice about it. They had been on the trail for about 40 minutes when the forest changed, not dramatically, not in any way that would register as a warning to most people. The birds had gone quiet. The undergrowth on the left side of the trail had stopped moving in the light breeze that had been pushing through it. Small things, the kind of things you notice only if you are already looking for them. The boys had drifted ahead, not far, maybe 20 feet, moving faster than Elena on a slight downhill stretch, the way kids do when the trail opens up a little. That gap, small as it was the condition the animal had been waiting for. They were moving along a straight section of trail when all 3 of them saw it at the same time. The mountain lion was crouched low in the brush to the left, partially concealed, watching them. It had not been visible a moment before. It was visible now because it had stopped caring whether it was. It was looking directly at the boys ahead, its body low and absolutely still. Elena closed the distance to her sons immediately, stepping in front of them, raising her arms and shouting. She told them to stay behind her and not to run. Mountain lions are the largest wildcats in North America, with adult males reaching up to 8 feet from nose to tail and weighing up to 220 pounds. They are ambush hunters, built to close distance in silence and target the back of the neck. They are significantly more likely to engage when a target is small or isolated. This animal, wildlife officials would later determine, was a young male that had been sighted near residential trailheads in the area on several occasions in the months prior, close enough to people, often enough, that it had stopped treating them as a reason to leave. Elena's response was correct. The problem was the animal she was responding to. A habituated lion does not reliably retreat from noise and posturing the way a wild one does. It has learned slowly and over time that humans are not a threat. It does not unlearn that in the middle of an encounter. The lion did not retreat. It shifted position slowly, circling to the left, lowering its body again, adjusting its angle without breaking its focus. Elena kept backing away, kept shouting, kept herself between the animal and her children. The attack came from behind and above. The lion had used its circling to reposition into the brush at Elena's back, and it came off an elevated section of the slope without warning. It struck her between the shoulder blades with its full body weight, driving her face first into the ground. The impact was immediate and total. Before she could push herself up, the lion had repositioned to the back of her neck, its jaws closing on the base of her skull and upper neck, the precise targeting that mountain lions use on prey, applied with the same mechanical efficiency. She continued to shout for her sons to run, even as she went down, her voice carrying down the trail. After a brief hesitation, both boys turned and fled. Elena Navarro died from her injuries before emergency responders reached her location. Authorities confirmed the mountain lion responsible and tracked it in the days that followed. The animal was a young male, with several prior sightings reported near the trailhead in the months before the attack. The official report noted that Elena's actions had almost certainly redirected the animal's focus away from her children. Both boys were found on the trail by other hikers approximately a quarter mile from the attack site. Elena's 2 sons were placed in the care of their father, who had been separated from Elena for 2 years prior to her death. He moved the family out of Colorado Springs within 6 months, relocating to a suburb of Denver, where nothing looked like a trailhead and nothing looked like a forest. The trail was temporarily closed following the incident. It reopened the following spring. The morning of November 11th, 2017 found the Central Pacific exactly as it had been for days. Flat, relentless blue in every direction, the horizon unbroken, the water below the vessel shifting from turquoise to a deep, lightless navy the further from shore you went. It was the kind of ocean that looked peaceful from the deck of a boat. From the water, it looked like something else entirely. Hannah Brooks had been at sea for 4 days when she decided to get in. Hannah was 29, a travel content creator from Sydney whose channel had grown steadily over 3 years on the back of one simple promise. She would go where other creators wouldn't. No safety nets, no staged moments, no comfortable distance between herself and the world she was filming. Her audience loved her for it. They loved the unfiltered quality of her content, the sense that they were seeing something real. Hannah loved it too. She loved the feeling of being exactly at the edge of something, and she had built a career out of finding that edge and stepping toward it. That instinct had served her well across 3 years of travel content. Remote jungle treks, overnight stays in places with no infrastructure, open water swims in locations that made her followers' palms sweat just watching. She had never been seriously hurt. She had come to think of that as evidence that her judgment was sound, that her instincts were reliable, that the line she kept approaching was one she understood. The vessel was crossing a remote stretch of the Pacific when she had the idea. The conditions were perfect: calm surface, good light, the kind of deep blue open ocean that photographs like a dream. She convinced the crew to stop. Just a few minutes in the water, she told them, a swim segment. The crew was hesitant. This was deep, isolated ocean, far from any coastline, the kind of water that oceanic white-tip sharks treat as their private territory. But Hannah was persuasive, and the conditions looked benign, and eventually they agreed. She entered the water with her camera. For the first few minutes, everything was exactly what she had imagined. The ocean stretched in every direction, vast and blue and silent. Then, quietly, the small fish that had been visible near the surface disappeared. The water below her seemed to empty out in a way that had no obvious explanation. Hannah didn't stop filming. The first shark appeared at distance, a slow, wide circle, its movements unhurried and deliberate. Hannah kept the camera rolling. A second shape appeared further out, less engaged but present. She kept filming. What she didn't recognize, or didn't allow herself to recognize, was that the first shark's circles were getting smaller. Each pass brought it incrementally closer, the behavior shifting from curiosity into something that marine biologists would later describe as active investigation. The escalation was gradual enough to rationalize at every individual step, and Hannah rationalized every one of them. The shark came from behind and below, a single exploratory bite to her leg, the kind of contact researchers call investigative. It pulled away. For a fraction of a second, there was stillness. Then, Hannah reacted. The rapid movement, the splashing, the sudden disruption at the surface. It changed everything instantly. Blood entered the water. On the boat, the crew was already shouting, someone throwing a line, another scrambling for the ladder. The water between the vessel and Hannah was no longer a place anyone could safely enter. The first shark turned back, faster now, the earlier deliberateness gone. The second shark began closing in, drawn by the disturbance, its movements less measured than the first. What followed was faster and more disorganized than anything the earlier circling had suggested. The primary shark came back hard. There was contact, chaos at the surface, the crew screaming from the deck. A line hit the water near Hannah, but the distance was wrong, the angle was wrong, and the situation was escalating faster than any of it could be corrected. The second shark was close now, circling the disturbance, occasionally lunging toward the surface. Hannah Brooks sustained fatal injuries in the water before she could be brought back aboard. It was February 14th, 2017, in a private wildlife compound outside Johannesburg, where the late afternoon heat settled over concrete enclosures and dry earth. The air was still, broken only by distant movement behind barriers, as long shadows stretched across the grounds under a fading, cloudless sky. Isabel Voss, 24, had spent her life on her family's licensed wildlife property outside Pretoria, helping care for animals her father had raised from cubs. When she was 6 years old, her father brought home Aslan, an 8-week-old white lion, and the two grew up side by side. What began as supervised interaction gradually turned into a routine that resembled something closer to sibling familiarity, running, playing, and sharing space during his early development. Adult male lions average around 400 pounds and are built for short bursts of explosive force. Their hunting method relies on rapid acceleration and immediate control of the target, typically by securing the throat or muzzle to restrict breathing while using body weight to bring the animal down. Despite being raised in captivity, Aslan retained these same physical capabilities and behavioral responses. That Tuesday, with her father in Johannesburg and workers repairing outer fencing, Isabel filmed content for a new YouTube channel centered on daily life with Aslan. She staged a birthday segment inside the enclosure, placing meat near the pool to control his position. Aslan had last been fed about 24 hours earlier. In the heat, he showed increased pacing. When he reached the setup, he consumed the meat quickly, scattering it across the concrete and disrupting the arrangement within seconds. Instead of stepping back, Isabel moved closer, reaching toward the food while he was still actively feeding, placing herself within arm's length. She picked up an object and threw it. It landed near his forelimbs, triggering a startled response. His head lifted, ears moved forward, and his attention shifted away from the food and directly onto her. The dynamic changed instantly. As Isabel turned her back and crouched to gather the scattered meat, Aslan lowered into a stalking posture behind her. His body went still, then moved. The distance closed in within seconds. He charged from behind, striking high across her back and shoulders with his forelimbs and driving her forward onto the concrete. She lost balance before she could turn. His jaws followed immediately, closing around the side of her neck in a throat hold. The bite compressed the airway and major blood vessels. Rather than crushing, the force restricted airflow and reduced blood flow to the brain. His weight pinned her to the ground, keeping the hold stable while preventing any escape. Her movements weakened quickly. With her airway squeezed and blood flow reduced, her attempts to push up or reach back lost strength almost immediately. Her hands pressed against his forelimb and jaw, but the grip stayed firm. Each breath became shorter than the last, stopping before her lungs could fully fill. Aslan stayed low and steady, his forelimbs pressed across her upper body, while his jaws held tight at the side of her neck. The grip didn't shake or thrash. It stayed controlled, tightening slightly as she moved. Her legs shifted briefly against the ground, then slowed. Her early resistance faded into uncoordinated movement as lack of oxygen set in. Within seconds, she lost strength. Her arms dropped and she couldn't push him off. Her breathing became weak, uneven, then stopped as blood flow to the brain dropped. Aslan held on a few moments longer, then released and stepped back, staying nearby but calm. He didn't keep attacking. A worker found the scene at 4:15 p.m. while checking water. Authorities were called, and Aslan was later tranquilized and secured. The coroner confirmed fatal neck trauma, with airway compression and carotid artery restriction leading to rapid loss of consciousness. The enclosure was deemed functional, though additional safety measures were later implemented. Aslan was relocated and the property was sold the following year. It was September 4th, 2017, when the first frost of autumn dusted the gravel bars along a remote salmon stream deep in Alaska's Katmai region. The sockeye run was tapering off, but enough fish remained to draw grizzly bears from across the drainage. A fly-in bear viewing operation ran day trips to the stream, ferrying small groups of visitors by float plane from a lakeside lodge roughly 40 miles to the east. Meredith Langard was a 61-year-old retired corporate attorney from Portland, Oregon, who had built a second career around adventure travel after leaving her firm. Her personality, described by acquaintances as forceful and unyielding, had served her well in courtrooms, but translated poorly to wilderness settings where compliance with guide instructions was a matter of survival. The morning group consisted of Langard and 2 other guests, accompanied by a bush pilot who doubled as the viewing guide. The guide, a 38-year-old Alaska native with 12 years of experience in the Katmai drainage, conducted a thorough briefing at the landing site. National Park Service regulations required a minimum distance of at least 50 yards from bears, with greater distances enforced at the guide's discretion depending on conditions. The guide emphasized that female bears with cubs represented the highest danger and that any approach would be dictated entirely by bear behavior. Langard challenged the buffer distances immediately, calling them excessive and accusing the guide of artificially limiting the experience. She pointed out that she had paid a significant sum for the trip and expected close-range photography opportunities. She told the other guests in the group that she had hiked in grizzly country before and that the distances being enforced were far beyond what was necessary. The guide explained that distance decisions were non-negotiable and based on real-time animal behavior. Langard told him she would be requesting a partial refund and speaking with the lodge owner about the quality of the guiding. The group observed several bears fishing along a shallow riffle for approximately 90 minutes. During a brief rest break, while the guide was attending to another guest's equipment near the riverbank, Langard walked upstream alone along a gravel bar. She rounded a bend and stopped. A female grizzly was fishing with 2 spring cubs at the river's edge, roughly 25 feet away. Langard raised her phone's camera rather than retreating. The wind was blowing downstream, carrying her scent directly toward the bear. The sow detected the scent and visually confirmed the threat almost simultaneously. Grizzly bears are North America's most powerful terrestrial predator, with adult females weighing between 300 and 450 pounds and males exceeding 800 pounds. Despite their bulk, grizzlies can sprint at speeds approaching 35 miles per hour over short distances. A female with cubs will charge with minimal warning when surprised at close range, relying on overwhelming force to neutralize perceived threats. Their claws, measuring up to 4 inches, can open deep lacerations with a single swipe, while their bite force is estimated to exceed 1,200 pounds per square inch. Most defensive attacks are brief but devastating, with the bear disengaging once the threat is neutralized. The The sow charged immediately. The distance left virtually no time for an effective reaction. The bear closed the gap in under 2 seconds, striking her with a forepaw that knocked her off her feet and onto the gravel bar. The bear bit down on her shoulder and upper arm, the crushing bite causing severe trauma to the shoulder and upper torso. The bear delivered several mauling bites and swipes in rapid succession before releasing, stepping back to assess whether the threat had ended. Langard lay motionless on the gravel. The bear circled once, snorting, then gathered her cubs and moved upstream at a fast walk. The bear had disengaged quickly, consistent with a defensive response rather than predation. The guide, alerted by the commotion, reached the bend within minutes. Langard was unconscious and bleeding severely from multiple bite and claw injuries concentrated across her face, scalp, arms, and upper body. The guide applied pressure and radioed for an emergency float plane extraction. The nearest trauma center was over an hour away by air. Langard never regained consciousness. She succumbed to her injuries shortly after arrival at the trauma center. While many defensive bear attacks are survivable, the extent of trauma and delayed evacuation contributed to a fatal outcome. The investigation determined that Langard had left the group without authorization and approached a female grizzly with cubs at a distance well inside the minimum safety requirement. The guide and operation were cleared of liability. It was December 12th, 2018, and the cool, dry winter had settled over the Terai, lowlands of southern Nepal, where subtropical forest met the flat agricultural plain along the Indian border. The buffer zone surrounding a major national park supported a patchwork of villages, jungle lodges, and community forests, where wildlife moved freely between the protected core and the inhabited periphery. In the months preceding this incident, the district had experienced a troubling pattern. A leopard had taken livestock from multiple villages along the park's buffer zone and had become increasingly bold around human settlement. 2 close encounters had been reported, with the animal spotted near occupied dwellings in daylight hours. Wildlife authorities believe the leopard was a subadult male displaced from the park's core territory by a dominant male, forced into a home range overlapping with villages. Trapping efforts had been unsuccessful. Lodges operating in the buffer zone had been warned, and several had implemented strict nighttime curfew policies for guests. Ilka Stegmaier was a 38-year-old freelance travel writer from Freiburg, Germany, on assignment for a boutique outdoor magazine. She had spent 10 days in Nepal, trekking in the Annapurna region before traveling south to the Terai for a 3-night stay at a small jungle lodge offering guided nature walks and birdwatching excursions. Stegmaier was an experienced traveler, comfortable in remote environments and accustomed to operating independently. The lodge consisted of 6 thatched roof cottages around a central garden, bordered by dense sal forest on 3 sides. A low bamboo fence marked the perimeter, intended as a boundary marker rather than a physical barrier. The lodge employed a night watchman who patrolled after dark with a flashlight and noisemakers. Upon check-in, the lodge manager briefed Stegmaier on safety protocols. Guests were not to leave the compound after dark under any circumstances. The manager specifically referenced the recent leopard activity and explained the animal had not been captured. Stegmaier acknowledged the briefing. She did not mention any plans to leave the compound after dark. On her second evening, conversation at dinner turned to the clarity of the winter sky. Stegmaier mentioned her intention to photograph stars for her article. The lodge manager reminded the group that all areas outside the lit compound were off limits after dark. According to the night watchman's subsequent statement, Stegmaier retired to her cottage at approximately 9:30 p.m. At approximately 11 p.m., the watchman noticed that the bamboo gate on the compound's forest-facing side was unlatched. A worn footpath led from this gate roughly 100 yards to a small clearing on a low ridge that staff used as a daytime viewpoint. Leopards are among the most adaptable and elusive large cats, with adult males weighing between 80 and 170 pounds and measuring up to 7 feet in length. They are primarily nocturnal hunters relying on stealth, patience, and explosive ambush from close range. A leopard's preferred killing method involves a powerful bite to the back of the neck or throat, targeting the spinal cord or windpipe. Unlike lions or tigers, leopards often attempt to drag prey into concealment after the kill, caching the body in dense vegetation to prevent scavenging. Leopards that have lost their natural wariness of humans through repeated proximity to settlements and successful livestock predation represent an acute danger, particularly to solitary individuals encountered at night in low visibility conditions. Investigators believe the following sequence is most consistent with the evidence. Stegmaier had walked along the footpath to the clearing, carrying her camera and a small headlamp. Boot prints indicated she had reached the clearing and stopped. The headlamp was found switched off on the ground near the camera's tripod, suggesting she had turned it off to avoid light pollution in her images, likely reducing her visibility of the surrounding area. Investigators noted that she had been crouching or seated at the time of the attack, based on the position of the tripod and the location of initial blood evidence. The leopard had approached from dense undergrowth at the clearing's edge. Based on physical evidence, the attack appears to have come from behind. The initial bite targeted the back of the neck, consistent with the species' ambush hunting pattern, though the injuries suggested the attack was not a clean, predatory kill. Claw marks across her shoulders and upper back indicated the animal had pulled her backward off the low ridge. Drag marks and blood evidence showed the leopard had moved Stegmaier's body an estimated 20 to 30 yards into dense brush, consistent with caching behavior. The night watchman raised the alarm at approximately 11:45 p.m. after discovering the open gate and Stegmaier's cottage empty. Lodge staff and villagers located her remains in the brush below the clearing at first light. Wildlife officers arrived that morning and confirmed the attack was consistent with a leopard ambush, though whether the behavior was predatory or opportunistic could not be fully determined. Track evidence was consistent with measurements from previous encounters, and investigators assessed it was likely the same individual. The District Wildlife Office intensified trapping efforts. A leopard believed to be the same individual was captured approximately 3 weeks later and removed from the area, though long-term outcomes for relocated leopards are often uncertain. The lodge suspended operations and reopened months later with reinforced barriers and mandatory escort policies.